The plane had been in the air for a mere 25 seconds when the pilots noticed weird noises and bizarre vibrations. They tried several ways to improve the situation, but nothing worked. The engine surges continued, and just over a minute into the flight, when the plane reached 3,000 feet, both engines failed. First the right one, 2 seconds later the left one. The pilots decided to return to the airport they had just left. At the same time, they tried to restart the engines. Nothing seemed to work. The flight crew made a decision to pitch the plane down and then level it off. Perhaps it could help them gain some speed for the glide. But soon, they realized they wouldn't make it to the airport. Was the plane going to crash? That's when the miracle at Gautura occurred. The morning before the flight started as usual. Regular pre-flight procedures, good weather. The members of the flight crew were experienced pilots. A 44-year-old Danish captain with over 8,000 flight hours under his belt, and a 34-year-old first officer from Sweden with 3,000 hours. So, what could go wrong? The plane itself was almost brand new. It was a McDonnell Douglas MD-81 nicknamed Dana Viking. It made its first flight on March 16, 1991. By that fateful day, the aircraft had been in service for a mere 9 months. There were 122 passengers and 7 crew members on board. Flight 751 Scandinavian Airlines was a scheduled flight from Stockholm, Sweden to Warsaw, Poland. On the way, the plane was supposed to make a stop in Copenhagen, Denmark. The aircraft took off from Stockholm according to its schedule at 8:47 a.m. local time. But by that point, the people inside had already been doomed, all because of a terrible sequence of events before the departure. It started the night before. The plane arrived at Stockholm Airport after a flight from Zurich. It was 10:09 p.m. The aircraft spent the night at the gate outside. It was cold. The temperature dropped to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing. What made the situation even worse was that almost 6,000 pounds of freezing cold fuel, chilled during the night, still remained in the tanks located in the wings. The fuel was so cold because the plane had been flying at the cruising altitude, where the air temperature outside the cabin varied from -61 to -80 degrees. The flight from Zurich lasted around 1 hour and 40 minutes. Soon after midnight, a flight technician came to check on the aircraft. The man had to remove some slush from the landing gear, otherwise he wouldn't be able to examine it. At around 2 a.m., when he was leaving, he noticed some ice covering the upper part of the wings. By the morning, the situation had become even dire. A layer of clear, almost invisible ice had formed on the tops of the wings. The plane had to leave the gate at around 8:30 a.m. An hour before the departure, the mechanic responsible for the plane noticed that some ice covered the underside of the wings. He decided to make sure there was no ice on the tops of the wings. He climbed a ladder and put one knee on the wing. Then he bent forward to touch the front part of the wing. There was no ice, just some slush. The mechanic decided to make sure everything was fine with the air inlet of one of the engines. He didn't find anything abnormal. Soon after that, the personnel used more than 220 gallons of de-icing fuel to remove ice from the plane. The mechanic consulted with the captain of the aircraft and ordered the staff to de-ice the underside of the wings as well. After all, he had seen some ice there. But no one thought to double-check if there was clear ice on the tops of the wings. After they had finished the procedure, the mechanic reported to the captain, "We're done here. De-icing finished. There was a lot of snow and ice, but everything's clear now." The captain thanked the mechanic and carried on with the pre-flight procedures. The plane taxied to the runway. Its engine's anti-ice systems were switched on and didn't show any malfunction. But several passengers later claimed they had seen ice sliding off the upper side of the wings while the plane had been taking off. And still, the plane left the ground and headed for Stockholm as usual. But shortly after the takeoff, several pieces of the overlooked ice broke off. At full speed, they slammed into the fans of the engines near the tail on both sides of the plane, ruining the blades. It led to a series of surges, and the rest is history. Meanwhile, somewhere in the cabin, Scandinavian Airlines flight captain Per Holmberg, who was on board as a passenger, noticed something was amiss. At first, he informed the flight attendant sitting in the rear jump seat that the right engine was surging. She tried to contact the flight crew, unsuccessfully. Then, the ununiformed captain rushed to the cockpit and asked if he could help the pilots. The first officer gave him the emergency checklist, and the captain asked him to start the auxiliary power unit, a small gas turbine in the tail of the plane. Holmberg's advice and help were invaluable, but was it enough to save the plane and the people inside? When the plane emerged from the cloud cover at an altitude of 890 feet, the pilots realized they wouldn't have enough time to make it back to the airport. An immediate emergency landing was unavoidable. The assisting captain passed the order to the cabin crew, and they started preparing the passengers. There was a large field to the north of the plane, but the captain realized they didn't have enough time to reach it. So he chose a much smaller field in a forested area in the direction of flight. It was not far from the village of Gautura in upland Sweden. The plane was just 1,300 feet above the ground when the assisting captain started extending the flaps. At a height of 183 feet, the captain reported to Stockholm Control, "We're crashing to the ground." 7 seconds later, the plane hit several trees and lost a huge chunk of its right wing. By that time, the landing gear had already been extended and the speed had decreased to 139 miles per hour. Moments later, the plane's tail struck the ground and broke off. The aircraft kept sliding across the field, still at high speed. It traveled 360 feet, with its main landing gear leaving marks on the field. At one point, the plane lost the main and nose landing gear. Its fuselage broke into 3 parts. Miraculously, there was no fire. If you look at the pictures from the crash site, the plane torn into pieces, with its parts scattered across the field, it's hard to believe that all 129 people on board the plane survived. It seems like a miracle, but it was also thanks to the flight attendants' quick reaction and the correct instructions they gave the passengers. They didn't panic and told the people to adopt the brace position just in time to avoid fatalities. Even more surprising, almost all passengers, except for 4 people, made their way out of the plane on their own. No wonder this accident was nicknamed the Miracle. The aircraft, though, wasn't as lucky. The 9-month-old plane was damaged so badly that it was an immediate write-off. Everyone praised the actions of the flight crew. The landing was incredibly skilled, especially in such a fast-developing, very dangerous situation. The captain himself admitted that few pilots were ever forced to put to the test the skills they got during training, at least not to this degree. He said he was proud of his crew and relieved that everyone had survived. And he never returned to piloting commercial planes. It only takes a moment for a routine flight to turn into a gripping survival story. In a world where a wrong button or an unexpected gust of wind can lead to a disaster, adhering to safety rules is crucial for everyone, from buckling seatbelts to raising window shades during landing. We got all these rules learning from our mistakes. Stay tuned to find out more. A flight had a crazy mid-air moment in 1993 when the pilot accidentally deployed the wing slats, the part on the leading edge of the wing. Now, the weather was fine, passengers were relaxed, everyone was doing what they wanted. Suddenly, they felt an unexpected jolt. Instantly, the autopilot disengaged. The captain started wrestling with the controls. The plane became wonky, pitching and rolling dramatically, resulting in a rapid descent of 5,000 feet. The vibration threw the cabin into total chaos, with passengers screaming in fear. The slats were only to be used during takeoffs and landings, not in mid-air. It was China Eastern Airlines Flight 583, cruising over the Pacific on its way from Shanghai to Los Angeles. The pilot declared an emergency and directed the plane to an Air Force base in Alaska. Out of the 255 people on board, 60 ended up in a hospital, and sadly 2 didn't make it. The pilot made some quick moves to stabilize the aircraft, but the injuries happened because folks weren't buckled in. They reckoned that the slats deployed because of the design of the control handle. The company was to blame for that. They produced it in such a way that the handle could accidentally get jiggled while cruising. Luckily, the crew was trained, and the airliner itself was fine, except for the messed-up cabin. The aftermath of this incident was costly, requiring about $1.5 million to repair the damage. When the plane started to lose altitude, overhead lockers burst open, and the safety video played 3 times for an eerie touch. Once the aircraft steadied, flight attendants jumped into action, providing first aid, leaving empty kits scattered in the cabin. It turned out that the poorly designed slat control handle had caused 11 similar incidents before. The captain probably nudged it accidentally while fixing the speed controls. The lack of pilot training on high-altitude issues and the stall warning system made things worse. If the passengers had kept their seatbelts on, injuries would have been way less severe. This has been the case during many other accidents. You probably know this airplane announcement. Even when the seatbelt sign is off, buckle up when you're seated. Experts say it's a good call. While flying is safe, keeping that seatbelt on is smart because you might hit unexpected turbulence. It's about keeping you secure during that bumpy, jarring time, especially that sneaky one during stormy weather. Sarah Wilson, the president of the Association of Flight Attendants, thinks the seatbelt sign should be turned on throughout the entire journey. Predicting turbulence is like trying to guess the weather. It's not 100% accurate. Turbulence can happen anywhere. Aircraft are tough. They can handle really bad turbulence. The real risk is getting injured during turbulence, not planes falling apart. It's rare, but accidents still happen. In a dramatic episode in 2016, a pilot pulled off a superhero move, saving 439 lives. He was getting ready for takeoff in Shanghai. All of a sudden, another plane showed up on the runway in front of him. Reacting with lightning-fast speed, the pilot swiftly elevated his plane, narrowly avoiding a disaster. The pilot was awarded $360,000 for his remarkable skills. He missed the other plane by less than 67 feet, about the length of a semi-trailer truck. It turned out that the air traffic controllers and the landing crew had mixed things up. 2 controllers lost their licenses, and 13 others got in trouble. They say this incident was like a throwback to the Tenerife airport collision in 1977. Back then, 2 jumbo aircraft collided on a foggy runway. They didn't get lucky that time. The incident was a total disaster. Certain accidents in aviation history prevented others. With each crash, something crucial is upgraded. In 1956, 2 planes collided over the Grand Canyon, resulting in the tragic loss of 128 lives on board. This accident kick-started a $250 million air traffic control system enhancement. The Federal Aviation Agency also appeared in 1958 to keep an eye on air safety. Then, in 1986, a private plane accidentally entered the Los Angeles control area, colliding with another aircraft. This tragedy took 86 people's lives. In response, collision avoidance systems were introduced. In 1978, United Flight 173 faced a landing gear problem. This led to a crash that claimed 10 lives. This incident triggered a transformation in cockpit training, introducing cockpit resource management. This management method shifted away from the traditional captain-centric approach to emphasizing teamwork and communication among the crew. Another upgrade was about averting in-flight emergencies. In 1983, Air Canada Flight 797 had smoke in the rear lavatory, which led to an accident that took 23 lives. The FAA responded by requiring smoke detectors and automatic fire extinguishers in aircraft lavatories. Post-1998, planes got retrofitted with fire-blocking seat cushions and floor lighting, with newer ones adopting flame-resistant materials. Winds can be dangerous in certain circumstances. The crash of Delta Flight 191 in 1985 brought attention to the dangers of wind shear. Research efforts by NASA and the FAA led to the development of forward-looking radar wind shear detectors. By the mid-90s, these became standard on airliners. The number of wind shear-related accidents has reduced significantly since then. In 1985, United Airlines Flight 232 faced a nightmare when the DC-10's engine failure left it virtually uncontrollable. Pilot Alfred Haynes landed the plane at a nearby airport, but the subsequent fire was terrifying. 185 passengers survived the catastrophe. The root cause of the incident was a crack in the fan disc, which occurred during the manufacturing of the titanium alloy. This incident prompted the FAA to modify the hydraulic system, implement redundant safety systems in future aircraft, and revolutionize engine inspection protocols. In 1988, a big chunk of an Aloha flight's fuselage ripped off in mid-flight. In an instant, the cabin was torn open, leaving the passengers exposed to the open sky. Despite the chaos, the pilots managed a safe landing, with only one fatality. The NTSB found that corrosion and fatigue damage, which had accumulated over 89,000 flight cycles, had caused this accident. The plane had been used for short-hop pressurized flights between the Hawaiian Islands. Shortly after, the agency initiated the National Aging Aircraft Research Program in 1991. This program tightened inspection and maintenance standards, especially for high-use and high-cycle planes. About 80% of mishaps happen in the first 3 minutes after takeoff or the last 8 minutes before landing. Keep your eyes peeled during these times, and your survival chances will go up. Now, don't let that freak you out. The odds of actually getting into a plane crash are like 1 in 11 million. That's the same possibility as being struck by lightning in a given year in the United States. Planes, on the other hand, often get struck by lightning, but they're built to handle it. Each plane probably gets zapped about once every year or every 3,000 hours it's up in the sky. But there hasn't been a lightning-related accident since 1967. Engineers have ensured that when a plane gets hit, the lightning just zips right through it and out without really messing up anything inside. Let's delve into the fascinating mechanics of how planes stay airborne. The wings are important, but it's not just about them. There are 4 forces at play: lift, thrust, drag, and weight. The little tails on the ends of wings are called winglets, and they help reduce air swirls, making the aircraft slicker and faster. There's a reason why lights dim when a plane lands at night. It prepares everyone for a quick evacuation, helping the eyes adjust to the dark should the landing go awry. You're in a bright room filled with obstacles, and suddenly the lights go out and you're asked to dash for the exit. Tricky. Flight attendants also ask you to raise those window shades during landing. In case of an emergency, they want you to be able to see what's outside and figure out if one side of the plane is better for a quick escape. If you're wondering where the safest spot in an airliner is, it's in the back. According to research conducted by Popular Mechanics, spanning from 1971 to 2005, sitting in the back gives you a 40% better shot at making it through an accident. Almost as importantly, you're closer to the restrooms.
An engine explodes during takeoff. The water injection system is switched off, and communication is lost. Now, this doomed plane faces the imminent threat of crashing into Athens or a hill. Will the captain be able to defy all odds and save over 400 lives on board? Stay tuned.
It's 2 in the afternoon. A Boeing 747 starts rolling down the runway, picking up speed. Just as Captain Sifis Migades lifts the nose of the aircraft, he's surprised by a loud bang. He has no idea what's just happened, but he's left with no options. The fully loaded plane is moving too fast to stop on the short runway space still left. The airplane begins its risky takeoff, and it's now heading straight for downtown Athens, which is absolutely crowded on a hot summer evening in August 9th, 1978. After the loud explosion, a flight attendant in the back takes the intercom and warns the crew about the catastrophic failure of engine number 3 located on the right side of the airplane. The flight attendant says, "I think we're screwed." And here's an honest, "Yeah, I know." The original plan of the Olympic Airways Flight 411 was a direct shot from Athens to New York. But now, this massive 370-ton jumbo jet simply doesn't have enough power to keep going up. The stress is through the roof. The flight is fully loaded with 18 crew members and 400 passengers, who are mostly U.S. citizens returning from their Greek summer vacation. Little do they know that the pilot still has to face 4 major problems in a 93-second period to ensure everyone stays alive. The first issue has to do with water injection. You see, this Boeing has 4 engines. Engine number 3 has just exploded, and engine number 2 is operating with reduced power after maintenance. So the pilot needs the remaining engines to give their all to get this plane climbing. The thing is, pushing the engines to the max creates a ton of heat. So, Captain Migades asks the onboard flight engineer to double-check if the cooling system is on, preventing the engines from getting too hot and maintaining a safe temperature. It's a bit tricky to explain what went wrong at this point, but experts think that in the heat of the moment, the flight engineer might have gotten a little mixed up. Instead of ensuring the water injection is on, he does the opposite and switches the system off just 9 seconds after takeoff. This mistake further reduces the power in the engines, limiting the plane's ability to climb by causing a loss of 4,500 pounds of thrust. So now, the plane finds itself in a seriously bad situation, barely cruising over the rooftops at below minimum speed. The second issue with this doomed aircraft involves the landing gear. The 55-year-old pilot had already had over 30 years of experience when he was assigned to command this flight. So he decides to make a bold move by telling his co-pilot to pull up the wheels at 35 feet above the runway. This move isn't just risky, it's straight up against Boeing rules in situations like this. Pilots usually have to wait until the aircraft gains a bit more altitude to pull up the wheels, because popping those landing gear doors open for 15 seconds adds more resistance against the plane's forward motion. In other words, it basically slows the plane down, and that's why the co-pilot hesitates for a second before agreeing to break the rule. Against all odds, the 411 flight stays in the air, but the problems are far from over. This leads us to the third issue. The plane is getting dangerously close to hitting one of the oldest capital cities in the world, Athens. The flight started from Ellinikon International Airport. This was the main airport for the Greek capital for decades, and it was known as one of the trickiest and riskiest airports in the world. Picture this: 2 short runways, side by side, squeezed between the Aegean Sea and large mountains. Even though there were 2 runways, they mostly used just one, the one pointing planes straight at the center of Athens. Because of that, pilots had to make an immediate left turn right after takeoff, changing the flight path over the sea. Now you might be wondering, why doesn't Migades just turn left already? Well, the speed of the 747 is way lower than it should be at this point. If he makes a turn, the plane might descend even more, upping the chances of crashing right into the city. So, the captain decides to keep climbing, following a straight path while he's figuring out Plan B. Do you remember that the airport is surrounded by mountains? Well, this is problem number 4. The pilot knows that in about a mile, the airplane will face a hill that's about 200 feet tall. As Migades watches Pawnee Hill getting closer and closer, he decides to give up a few knots of airspeed to gain the altitude he desperately needs to fly over the hill. Migades feels relief when he sees that his risky plan has worked. The airplane flies over the hill with only 9 feet to spare. Yet, the relief fades quickly. He still needs to come up with an emergency landing plan. Imagine the cockpit eerily silent. They don't have contact with the tower anymore. While the 2 pilots are doing everything they can to keep Flight 411 from crashing, the flight engineer is still focused on fixing the problems with the engines. The terrain gets lower after the plane flies over Pawnee Hill, so the captain decides to lower the nose of the plane to trade a bit of altitude for speed. But nothing happens. In fact, the airplane's speed just keeps dropping, and they're barely exceeding an altitude of 200 feet. The plane is so low that it's even taking down some television antennas. It's around the height of a 14-story building named the Inter-American Tower. The airplane gets so close to that building that some flight attendants can actually see people's faces inside. A happy ending seems unreal as the plane is approaching a catastrophic collision with Mount Aigaleo, which is over 1,500 feet high. But suddenly, the engines kick in with more power and the plane starts picking up speed. Some specialists believe the acceleration was due to the combination of three things. The wind shifted, the temperature outside dropped, and the water injection system kicked back in. And the good news is that with more power in the engines, the pilot successfully gains altitude. By 2:05, Migatis managed to turn left, avoiding a collision with Mount Aigaleo. The plane is heading towards the ocean. It keeps flying for over 30 minutes to dump fuel. The idea is to make the aircraft lighter before landing, as it's loaded with 160 tons of fuel needed for the transatlantic flight. After that, the captain brings the aircraft back to the same runway from which they took off, and they land safely at Aloha Airport. Everyone on board is safe, not a scratch on them, all thanks to this pilot who bravely broke the rules to save his crew and passengers. Now, picture the wild applause on the ground, and Migatis' daughters eagerly waiting for their father as he exits the plane. And it's no small feat, this pilot did the unthinkable. To put it in perspective, every Boeing simulation of this same flight ended in a crash. Migatis' impressive achievement led Olympic Airways to modify some of its procedures, and Boeing began to include a review of this case in its training curriculum. Now, you might be thinking that Migatis was traumatized after this accident and never wanted to board an aircraft again. But nope. Remember, we're talking about a real hero. At 6 p.m. on that same day, Migatis took his seat in the cockpit of a replacement Boeing 747 and flew 400 passengers over the Atlantic to New York. As for the aircraft, it stuck around with Olympic Airways for a couple of years until it joined Trans World Airlines in 1985. This 747 Boeing's career ended in 1997 after 24 years of service.
February 2nd, 1970. We're at an Air Force base in Montana. Today, the 71st Fighter Interceptor Squadron plans to hold a training sortie. 4 pilots get into jet planes and take off. Shortly, one of the pilots accidentally activates the braking parachute. A fabric dome shoots out of the plane. It's filled with air and interrupts the flight of the aircraft. The pilot has to land. The other 3 pilots continue the training. They arrive at the designated place and begin to simulate an air fight. Every pilot is a professional in his field. They have undergone similar training many times. But something amazing is going to happen today. The pilot of one plane, Major Curtis, must fight with 2 other planes. One of the Major's opponents is Captain Faust. 2 planes are chasing the target. Major Curtis turns his jet and directs it straight upwards. The other 2 planes follow suit. The Major performs a maneuver, vertical rolling scissors. He flies up in a spiral while simultaneously making a barrel roll. Then he turns around and flies down, performing a dive. The pursuers are not far behind. Major Curtis makes another aerial maneuver. He goes to the side and flies past Captain Faust. At this moment, the captain's plane begins to shake. Its front part lowers, and the jet hurtles to the ground at great speed. Captain Faust can't do anything. The plane doesn't listen to him. The control stick doesn't work. The engine's breaking down. The captain activates the braking parachute, but that doesn't work either. The plane is getting closer and closer to the ground. It can no longer be saved. Now it's important to save at least Captain Faust's life. He ejects and opens the parachute. Suddenly, the abandoned plane starts to fly straight. The flaps on the wings are activated, and it stops falling down. The plane without a pilot flies and slowly descends. It goes at a speed of 200 miles per hour and disappears from sight behind the cliffs. Captain Faust lands safely on a snow-covered field. The other pilots see this and are afraid the plane will fall in a nearby town. They immediately head in that direction. At the time, the unguided aircraft descends, touches the ground, and slides along the field. Next, it makes a 20-degree turn and breaks through a small fence. The plane stops at a farmer's field. The owner of the farm calls the local sheriff. The sheriff arrives and calls the nearest military base to report what happened. He approaches the fallen plane to assess the damage and turn off the humming engine. But as soon as he gets closer, the plane begins to hum and shake as if it wants to escape from there. The plane owners arrive. They are surprised because the plane is in almost perfect condition. They deliver it back to the base, repair it, and return it to service. In 2016, in Belgium, a train was traveling without a driver. That day, people at 2 railway stations saw a train slowly moving between them. It didn't make any stops, brake, or accelerate. It was just slowly riding onwards. Passengers couldn't contact the driver and get out of the vehicle because no one was controlling the train at the time. Panic was rising. People began to say that a ghost train without a driver appeared. But the truth turned out to be not so mysterious. The empty passenger train had been leaving the station according to the schedule when the driver noticed some kind of malfunction. He stopped the train and got out of the cabin to see what happened. But for some reason, the train started again by itself, and the driver didn't have time to jump on it. Fortunately, everything ended well. The driver warned all his colleagues about the runaway train. Everyone was evacuated from the train stations. Then, at some station, one brave driver jumped into the cabin right on the move and stopped the stray train. Speaking of ghost trains, you can see such things in the UK. They pass through railway stations that have long been abandoned. If you get on such a train, you'll probably be the only passenger. Authorities let these trains drive because it's economically profitable for the country. To cancel the route of a ghost train, you need to go through a lot of bureaucratic procedures and spend tons of extra money. So, they travel all over the country and don't bother anyone. Now we go to the ocean to learn about the ship that was drifting for several months without its captain. The ship's called Alta. It was bought by a new owner in 2017 and marked with the flag of Tanzania. Almost all cargo ships are equipped with AIS, Automatic Identification System. That's a navigation system that works on the principle of GPS. All vessels are equipped with AIS, so their movement in the ocean can be tracked. This feature was disabled for the Alta. The ship disappeared from the satellite's eyes and reappeared several times. In 2017, it sailed by Greek port cities. The Alta made 12 stops in 3 such towns in different parts of Greece. Then the AIS signal disappeared. 10 months later, the Alta appeared again on the northern coast of Africa. In September 2018, it was headed to Haiti. During this trip, the ship's engine failed. The nearest shore was far away. The ship began to drift. A few days passed. The crew couldn't repair the vessel. The food supply was almost out. The situation was getting worse as a strong hurricane was approaching the place where the ship broke down. Fortunately, a rescue boat came to the sailors. They were all evacuated shortly before the hurricane hit. The Alta stayed drifting in the ocean. After a while, another ship came to tow it to the coast of Guyana. But something went wrong. Somebody stole the Alta. It's unknown who did it and why. Then, almost 1 year passed. In the waters of the Atlantic Ocean, a British Navy ship notices the drifting Alta. There's no one on board. No one controls it. Then, almost 6 months later, a resident of a small town in Ireland sees the abandoned ship off the coast. Somehow, the Alta was able to cover the distance across the Atlantic and wash up on the coast of Ireland. The Irish authorities said it had been a miracle that no one else saw the ship. It sailed calmly for such a long distance, surviving storms. They started an investigation to establish the owner of the vessel. It's important to find a responsible person who will tow off the Alta. It's extremely difficult to do so, though. They didn't find the owner. One day, an unknown person called the Irish authorities and introduced themselves as the proprietor of the Alta, but didn't provide any evidence. But the record for the longest drifting vessel along the ocean belongs to the SS Bechimo. People were seeing this ghost ship at different times for 38 years. It was a merchant ship owned by a Canadian trading company. In 1931, the ship got blocked by ice off the coast of Alaska. A strong snowstorm began. The crew waited a week for the bad weather to end, but the storm only intensified. One day, when the storm subsided a bit, part of the crew went to the nearest town. The rest of the crew members and the captain set up camp near the vessel. The storm didn't stop for a long time. The blizzard was so strong that people couldn't see beyond their stretched hands. Finally, when the storm was over, the captain went to find the ship. And couldn't. He decided it sank during the snowfall. A week later, the ship was found, drifting near the place where it was lost. Its hull was damaged so badly that it was unsafe to sail on it. The captain decided to abandon the vessel. However, it didn't sink. For the next 38 years, it was seen drifting at various points along the coast of Alaska. The last time people saw the frozen ship stuck in the ice was in 1969. In 2006, a special project was created to find SS Bechimo. However, in all these years, they've found nothing. Its fate is still unknown. It's likely the ship found peace on the seabed of the Chukchi Sea.
Look into this man's eyes. His whole life is flashing before them right now. His childhood, youth, dreams of the future. He's now at an altitude of 18,000 feet, free falling to the ground without a parachute. There's no one to help him, and he can only be saved by an incredible miracle. And then it happened. Joseph B. Herman is a 21-year-old flight lieutenant pilot for the Royal Australian Air Force. It's Saturday, November 4th, 1944. His Handley Page Halifax is about to take off from Driffield, England. Tonight, they're flying to the coal mines near Bochum, Germany. So our hero takes the helm and joins the raid with 749 aircraft. Little does Herman's squadron know, the defenders are ready for their arrival. Within moments, the unit finds themselves surrounded by anti-aircraft cannons below. These things can reach targets flying at 39,000 feet. The planes on this mission are flying half that high. It's a recipe for disaster. That's when the night sky gets set on fire, with planes going down right and left. Herman must keep his cool. He has to show his best skills to keep himself and his crew of 6 out of harm's way. They end up completing the mission. But just 5 minutes later, boom, Herman's plane is hit in the rear spar. The aircraft catches fire, and the pilot must take quick, decisive action to save everyone on board. His thoughts are racing, but not fast enough. 2 more shells hit the plane's wings. The fire engulfs the aircraft. Herman immediately orders all the crew members to jump out of the plane. But he knows he can't abandon the ship. He'd taken his chute off a bit earlier because it was uncomfortable. The lieutenant has to get to the engineering compartment where his parachute is if he's going to make it out of this thing. But as soon as he leaves his seat, the aircraft's right wing tears off. Within milliseconds, the plane rolls and then explodes. Its burning parts approach the Earth like a meteor shower. What's left of the Halifax falls outside the small town of Neviges, damaging someone's cottage so badly that the owners eventually had to demolish it. But what happened to Joseph Herman? Rewind back to when the plane blew apart. The force threw the pilot, still without a parachute, out of the aircraft. He's now in free fall among the wreckage 18,000 feet up. The next 90 seconds will decide his fate. It's dark, but our hero initially tries to search for a parachute among the falling debris. The search isn't successful. Panic sets in. Herman shouts and waves his arms, but then the Australian pilot realizes he's doomed. Best not to waste the last of his energy and time. He relaxes and tries to find the safest place to land below. A minute passes. He's fallen 12,000 feet, 30 seconds left until impact. As soon as Herman reaches an altitude of 6,000 feet, what happened next can only be described as a miracle, or at least incredibly good luck. His body crashes into something. This something is different from the lifeless wreckage of the plane. The lieutenant realizes they're a person's legs. He hears a familiar voice. "Hello, is someone there?" It's the Halifax's mid-top gunner, John Vivish. "Just me, Joe," the pilot replies. The odds are astounding, but I'll get into that a bit later. For now, the men aren't out of the woods yet. That parachute wasn't made to be used by two people at the same time. With the added weight of an unexpected passenger, the two fall faster than what's safe. They approach the ground and get ready for impact. It's still a hard fall. Vivash lands on Herman's chest and injures a couple of his ribs. But they don't have time to rest or inspect the damage. They're still behind enemy lines. Their dangerous adventure has only just begun. First, they quickly bury their parachute to cover their tracks. They need to leave this crash site now to avoid being captured. The airmen are able to hide from patrols and remain undetected from the night of November 4th until the morning of November 9th. They move only at night. During the day, they hide in the woods and random barns. They're hungry, hurting, and exhausted. These two poor fellows reach the village of Wolfrath. Their injuries are making themselves known. Our heroes must take a risk if they're going to survive. They ask for help at a local farm. They're immediately handed over to the authorities and locked up. Herman and Vivash are questioned for a long time. None of the German officers can believe their incredible story of being saved by a single parachute. In the end, they had to show the place where they buried it, and only then could they prove the truth of their impossible story. But this didn't get them out of trouble, and they remained in custody. The two spent 11 days in the hospital. Then they were separated and sent to two different places for captured airmen. Lieutenant Herman was transferred from place to place 3 times until he was released from captivity on April 22, 1945. Well, finally we can breathe a sigh of relief. This story has a good ending. But all this is the result of an unbelievable combination of circumstances. So much could have gone wrong. For example, Lieutenant Herman could have been injured at the very moment his plane was hit. You see, those anti-aircraft projectiles throw dangerous shrapnel when they explode, which could have immediately made this story a lot shorter than what it ended up being. He also wasn't knocked unconscious. If he had been out cold, he would have just bumped into Vivash's legs and kept falling, instead of grabbing onto them in an instant. And then there was this intense freefall. They were falling exactly in line with each other, yet they bailed from the plane at different times. At that moment, Vivash had happened to be in a horizontal position, allowing Herman to grab onto his legs. And Vivash had just opened his parachute the same moment Herman grabbed onto him. Any earlier, and they wouldn't have met, or if they did, they would have collided with a huge force and probably bounced off each other like billiard balls. If Vivash had opened his chute after the already unlikely meeting, Herman wouldn't have been able to keep his grip. This number of coincidences would make anyone doubt the legitimacy of this story. Well, in February and March 2014, a group of volunteers and German archaeologists did excavations at the supposed crash site. They found about 40 parts and fragments that undoubtedly belonged to Joseph B. Herman's plane. So, 70 years later, the story turned out to be undeniably true. After the end of all the events of 1945, Lieutenant Joseph B. Herman of the RAAF lived a quiet, simple life. He became a crop duster pilot with an incredible story to tell.
Do you know the feeling when you've been trying to solve one mystery for your entire life? Nope? Well, Detective Anderson does. During almost 30 years of working for the police, he solved many riddles, caught hundreds of robbers, and helped save thousands of lives. There's a huge number of successfully solved cases on his record. At the age of 25, he caught a thief who changed his own face with plastic surgery once a year. When Anderson was 30, prisoners started breaking from jails all over the world. The detective successfully solved this case. At the age of 38, he discovered the secret base of a forbidden order in a volcano's mouth. By his 50s, he managed to explain all the most inexplicable things in the world. But there was something he couldn't solve. These were 2 mysteries from the 50s, cases of missing planes. All these years, Anderson has been scrolling through the details of this puzzle. Unfortunately, he was too young when this story began. All he had were guesses and notes. But today, a sudden thought struck him. For the first time in many years, he felt that he could finally solve this mystery. But to do this, He had to immerse himself in this story again. So he opened the closet and pulled out 2 old magazines with detailed articles about these incidents. The first one happened in the summer of 1955. July 1st, Pan Am Flight 914 was about to depart from New York Airport with 61 people on board. The plane model was a Douglas DC-4. It differed from modern aircraft, having giant propellers instead of turbines. So, all passengers fastened their seatbelts. The plane started taxiing down the runway, sped up, and took off. It went high into the sky and out of sight. Its destination was Florida. The flight time would be 3 hours. Dispatching services were watching the plane on their radar when suddenly, Pan Am 914 disappeared. The operator tried to contact the pilot but received no response. New York reported this to Florida. They said they couldn't see the plane either. Usually, pilots notify via radio if a plane crashes or gets into a storm. But this time, just nothing. After several unsuccessful attempts to establish the connection, they deployed large-scale search operations. Communication with the plane was interrupted when it was flying over the Atlantic Ocean. Therefore, the air company had to admit the aircraft crashed into the water. But this version had no proof. When planes fall that way, rescuers find floating debris. Some parts of the cabin or luggage always get to the surface. This time, rescuers found nothing. The plane didn't transmit any distress signals and didn't leave any traces of the crash. It seemed like it just disappeared into thin air. People forgot about this disaster for 37 years. And then, something bizarre happened. 1992, Venezuela, Caracas Airport. The control tower received a signal about an unknown aircraft approaching them. It was weird because it wasn't supposed to be there. There were no flights scheduled for that time. The plane was landing. The dispatcher and the rest of the airport staff understood that something was wrong here. The plane looked old, with huge propellers instead of turbines. After landing, the pilot contacted the airport.
Where are we?
The dispatcher asked him to identify himself. A few seconds later, he received an answer.
We are Pan Am Flight 914, departed from New York to Florida, with a crew of 4 people and 57 passengers on board.
The dispatcher didn't know what to do next. He and the airport staff understood what kind of plane they were looking at. What was this plane doing 37 years later, and almost 1,240 miles away from its destination? After a few seconds, the startled dispatcher turned on the microphone and said,
It is September 9th, 1992. You know that?
A long pause followed. Then, the pilot responded in a panic.
Oh no. Jimmy, where are we? No! Stay away! Let's go now!
The airport staff saw the pilot waving his hands in horror through the glass. Then, he started the engines and took the plane to the runway. Pan Am 914 increased its speed and took off. The dispatcher tried to stop him, but the pilot didn't respond. The plane disappeared into the sky, and no one else had heard of it since that day. Detective Anderson finished reading the article. He frowned and looked out the window. Raindrops were hitting the glass. The storm outside perfectly depicted what was happening in his mind at that moment. He seemed to know what had happened to that plane. All the clues were there, lying right in front of his eyes. But to know for sure, Anderson had to move on to the next case. It was another article, dated 1989. It happened in 1954. Santiago Airlines Flight 513 took off from West Germany Airport. The plane was due to land in Brazil in 18 hours. There were 88 passengers and 4 crew members on board. The plane hid behind the clouds and disappeared from all radar. Air traffic controllers were trying to contact the pilots, but didn't receive a response. 18 hours later, they called the airport in Brazil. Those dispatchers couldn't confirm this plane's landing and couldn't contact the pilots either. The search operation lasted for several months, but they found nothing. Just like in the Pan Am 914 case, the plane disappeared from radar while flying over the Atlantic Ocean. 2 years later, the search operation ended, and Santiago Airlines ceased its activities. October 12, 1989. Airport controllers in Brazil noticed a passenger plane that suddenly appeared on their radar. It didn't answer the airport staff's questions and just circled over the airbase. After a few minutes, the plane landed and nothing. No one opened the ramp. Passengers didn't get out. Pilots didn't respond. The aircraft was in perfect condition. One of the dispatchers realized that this was the missing Santiago Airlines Flight 513 that had been considered lost for 35 years. Airport staff approached the plane and opened the doors. What they saw there terrified them. The police, customs staff, doctors, detectives, and other airport staff members gathered around the plane. No one knew what to do next. There was no living person on board who could tell the truth. The plane disappeared in 1954 and appeared 35 years later in perfect condition without any damage. So far, no one has figured out what happened. Detective Anderson noticed the stories were very similar. Pan Am 914 disappeared in 1955. Santiago Airlines 513 vanished in 1954. The difference was almost a year. Anderson scratched his head and noticed another little detail. Both planes went missing from the radar the moment they were flying over the Atlantic Ocean. There are many myths about phantom ships and mysterious phenomena connected with the Bermuda Triangle. Detective Anderson knew these tales, but these two missing planes puzzled him. He looked at two articles and understood everything. Exactly! The solution was there, right in front of his eyes. Both stories were written in the same newspaper. There was no real dispatcher who communicated with the planes. Nothing was known about the passengers. No newspapers except this one published news about these missing aircraft. It seemed they just took the same story and changed the dates, locations, and names of flights. Yes, the case was solved. It was all fake. The rain stopped. Detective Anderson looked out the window and heard the sound of a passing train. He remembered another weird and fake story. A story about a phantom train. It took place in Italy in 1911. 100 passengers boarded the train of the Zanetti Railway Company. It went through the picturesque mountainous area, got into a mountain tunnel, and disappeared. No one else had seen the train since then. All the passengers were lost, but not for long. They appeared in the past. There were records dated 1845. One unknown doctor from Mexico City wrote about 100 Italians who appeared in the city from nowhere. They were all dressed strangely and talked about one mysterious train. This was a completely made-up story. There was no proof or records about this train and the people who got into the past. A loud sound interrupted his thoughts. Detective Anderson picked up the phone. He was silently listening to the person on the other end of the line. A minute later, he answered, "Yes." The detective put the phone down. It was a new mystery for him. In the Sahara Desert, the locals noticed a huge ship lost in the South Pacific 27 years ago. There was no crew on board, no cargo, and no flags. No one knew how it appeared among the sand, but wet mud formed around it because of moisture. It seemed like the ship had just teleported there from the water. Perfect! No fakes this time. Detective Anderson put on his hat and left the office. But this story is for another video.
Her name is Lillian Boyer. Wait a minute, why is she standing on the wing of an airplane? Well, from 1921, Lillian made a living doing completely crazy mid-air stunts on planes. She really knew how to put on a good show, and she became famous all over the United States. But Lillian started her unusual career completely by accident. She was a regular 21-year-old waitress at a Chicago restaurant. That changed when two pilots named Elmer Partridge and Johnny Metzger became frequent customers there. One day, they offered Lillian a ride in their old biplane, a Curtiss JN-4D Jenny. She agreed, and they headed over to the local airport. Soon, Lillian was in the air. It was the first flight of her life, and she was incredibly excited. Flying didn't scare her at all. In fact, with a strong wind blowing in her face and the noise of the engine ringing in her ears, Lillian realized that planes were her calling. 4 days later, Partridge asked her if she wanted to take another flight. This time, Lillian decided to do something bold. When the plane was flying at 65 miles an hour, she got out of her seat and stood on the wing. But even then, she wanted more. So she walked all the way to the edge. The whole time, Partridge was screaming at her to sit down because he thought she was going to jump. She could barely hear his voice because of the engine noise. But Lillian wasn't scared at all. She actually enjoyed it. When the pilot saw what she could do, he introduced her to Billy Brock. He worked at the Chattanooga airport and was looking for someone who could do tricks on the wing of a plane. They shook hands and soon got started on Lillian's training. Lillian quit her restaurant job and started training full-time. For 5 months, she practiced doing stunts in a barn at Chattanooga. She used a model plane which had soft mattresses placed underneath it for safety. She did gymnastics with an instructor, as well as running and other sports, and she changed her eating habits. Soon, she was ready for a real flight. And she proved she was the best. Lillian was the first female stunt person to perform tricks like hanging from a plane using one hand or hanging by her knees or ankles. Her bravery amazed people, and she quickly became very popular. She and Brock started doing air shows at various fairs and festivals, and she turned into a real star. When they came to town, the crowd always recognized them. There was always a car waiting for Lillian, and she had a lot of passionate fans. Lillian was the only woman at the time who could perform one very risky stunt. She would get out of the cockpit holding a thin wire, which had a mouthpiece at the end of it. She would do a few tricks on the edge of the wing and then hang under the plane, holding on by only her teeth. The spectators couldn't see the wire from hundreds of feet below, so it looked both pretty shocking and amazing. The crowd would erupt into screams when Lillian performed this trick. Then Brock would lower a special ladder and she'd grab it and go back to her seat. But there were also accidents. These reminded Lillian and Brock that they were engaged in a very dangerous business and that they had to be as careful as possible. During one of their shows in 1924, they planned to do an unusual trick. Brock was going to do a loop while Lillian was standing on the biplane's top wings. The idea was for her to slip her feet into some straps, and the centrifugal force of the loop would help Lillian keep her balance. But during the actual trip, something went wrong and the strap broke. Lillian smashed really hard into the wing, but she still managed to climb back into her seat. She was injured, but she kept on doing her shows. When she was performing in Trenton, New Jersey, in October 1925, Lillian had another 3 accidents during some parachute jumps. On the first day of the show, the wind took her away from her landing spot and she fell onto the seat of a Ferris wheel. Some of the audience thought it was just another crazy stunt, but it was actually a very dangerous situation. Luckily, the Ferris wheel operator realized that Lillian was in trouble and stopped the ride. The second time, she couldn't control her chute and struck the roof of the grandstand. She hit it hard and got stuck there, and people had to look for a ladder to help Lillian down. On the third day of her show, Lillian's parachute almost landed on a tent, so she pulled on the shrouds as hard as she could to change direction. But this made the parachute turn inside out, and Lillian fell about 50 feet straight into the ground. She suffered a lot of injuries and had to be hospitalized, but she was treated very well. She was in the hospital for 2 months, and all of her bills were paid by an anonymous person. Lillian thought it was probably the president of the fair. He liked her. In fact, since she was a star, a lot of men admired her. But she didn't risk her life for money or fame. Lillian did all this for herself. Brock got almost all the money from their performances, and that was her decision. They usually perform for 2 or 3 days straight, or even a whole week. They were paid $1,000 to $1,200 for one performance, but Lillian only got $100. As she said herself, that was a decent amount of money, and it was enough for her. So Brock ran the business, maintained the plane, and hired mechanics and crew. But their show was called Lillian Boyer's Flying Circus, and there was a reason for that. Brock was in love with Lillian. Constantly working together made the two of them close. It didn't work out though. Lillian told him that there wouldn't be anything between them. But he still cared about her, and Lillian really appreciated him for that. She trusted her pilot with her life, and she admired his skill. In fact, she said he was the best pilot she ever knew. Before every flight, he double-checked all the systems, wires, and mechanisms. He would tell her where to go, and Lillian would listen to him. And it was Brock who came up with most of the tricks. There was total trust between them, and they worked as one. After Brock passed away, Lillian kept doing stunts with another pilot, but she couldn't trust him like she had trusted Brock. One of her signature tricks was switching from a car to a plane, but she never did it with the new pilot. During her stunt career between 1921 and 1928, Lillian performed 352 shows in 41 U.S. states and Canada. She performed 143 changes from a car to a plane and made 37 parachute jumps. But in 1928, low-altitude flying was banned, and so dangerous stunts performed on the wings of airplanes became history. Almost half a century later, Lillian once again became a celebrity at the San Diego Aerospace Museum. An entire section of it was devoted to her incredible achievements. Lillian was the guest of honor at all the events there. One evening, she was given one of the most pleasant surprises of her life. It was a flight on a Boeing PT-17 biplane. This time, now in her 80s, Lillian didn't walk on the wings or perform dangerous stunts. But when she landed, she admitted that she really wanted to. The pilot had told her not to get out of the cockpit. Plus, she couldn't trust him as much as she had trusted Brock.
When it's too cold outside, airplanes often get delayed, or in extreme cases, even cancelled altogether. First of all, if it snows heavily, such conditions drastically decrease visibility, making it unsafe to taxi and take off. During a blizzard, flight control may command the aircraft to stay on the ground and wait until the snowstorm subsides. Ice on the runway is another reason. An airplane's landing gear are nothing like a car's wheels, and they can't be equipped with studs to avoid skidding. But even if they were, a plane needs to develop speeds on the ground that are much higher than on an average road to take off successfully. If the runway is slippery with ice, the airplane can slide off it easily. Things like this actually happened in the past. For example, in January 2014, the JFK airport in New York was shut down after a plane skidded off the runway and into the snow. Luckily, no one was injured, but the airport staff had to dig the aircraft out of the snow, and even the local police joined the efforts. Same story with landing, which is even trickier in freezing conditions because a plane is in much less of a controlled environment and traveling at even greater speeds. What's more, while an airplane that's about to take off and skidding will probably get into an open area and stop there, one that's about to land could end up crashing into the airport's infrastructure. Needless to say, that's way more dangerous for everyone. Freezing weather conditions can also cause frost and ice sheets to build up on the plane itself. Airplanes are carefully engineered, and any tampering with their structure may cause huge trouble. As experienced pilots say, even a thin crust of ice over the wings of a plane can mess with their delicate design and destroy lift. Planes can be de-iced though. The airport staff usually spray them with a special solution that doesn't let the ice build up on the aircraft's skin. But back to the runway. If it's covered with ice, there's little you can do. Unless the sun is shining, the chances of safely removing the ice from the pavement are almost zero. There's also a chance of damaging the pavement, making potholes, which can result in safety concerns for both takeoff and landing. Imagine driving over a pothole in a car at full speed. Pretty unpleasant. And now multiply it by about 1,000, because a plane is much heavier than a car, and don't forget that the landing gear is not exactly there for driving. Jet fuel and the equipment that pumps it can freeze too if the temperature is too low. The fuel freezes at -40 degrees Fahrenheit, but that can only happen on the ground before takeoff. At a cruising altitude, temperatures may drop as low as -70 degrees Fahrenheit, but since the liquid is inside the plane and burning down steadily, it's much warmer there. On the ground though, nothing stops the fuel from turning into ice. If that happens, no flights are available, obviously. Same goes for the pumping equipment. Even if the fuel is still liquid, the pump may cover with ice and just stop delivering the fuel into the plane's tanks. In the worst-case scenario, it might even break down, leading to expensive repairs and prolonged delays in flights. Finally, ground crews have to do a lot of work before takeoff or landing, and they're all human after all, so they can't bear the freezing cold for too long. This issue is often resolved by tag teaming. One group of workers goes out in the field to do the job, while the other is waiting for them in a shelter. After 20 minutes or so, the first group returns to warm up, and the second one takes up the job where the first one left it. Although it's efficient, it still slows down the operations a lot, so that might also cause delays. But despite all the trouble freezing weather can cause, it's actually more beneficial for a plane than extreme heat. Cold air is denser than hot, so planes gain more lift and stay truer while in the air. They're more easily controlled in flight too. Air molecules are slower and closer together, creating a steady flow of air around the wings and cockpit. At high altitudes, the air naturally becomes thinner as the air molecules spread out and become more scarce. That's exactly why planes can't get to the upper layers of the atmosphere. There's just not enough air there to create sufficient lift. The same happens when it's too hot down on the ground though. Air molecules get faster and spread out, meaning the plane's wings don't have as much air to push off and get into the flight mode. To take off in extreme heat, a plane has to move much faster to generate enough air resistance and lift. But to move faster, the plane needs its engines to work better, and that's also impossible when it's too hot. As the air gets thinner, the amount of oxygen decreases too. And jet engines use oxygen in the atmosphere for combustion. When they lack this crucial element, they can't convert enough energy into thrust, meaning slower acceleration and worse energy output overall. So the problem is that the plane has to have a longer runway distance to build up enough speed and lift to take off. But it can't because its engines are not working to the best of their ability. This usually doesn't cause trouble, but only up to a point. When the temperatures on the ground level reaches about 120 degrees Fahrenheit, some flights can get cancelled because it's simply dangerous for them to try and take off. Other planes are more heat resistant and powerful, but that also depends on the heat. Some aircraft even have to reduce their weight by removing part of their fuel, cargo, or even passengers when it's too hot. Lighter load means better acceleration before takeoff, and it doesn't help to avoid cancellations, but it also means planes aren't working to their full capacity. The average cruising altitude for an airplane is about 35,000 feet. They don't technically need to be so high up, but that altitude gives the best speed and efficiency. Air gets thinner at higher altitudes, which means less wind resistance, but less lift. For most commercial aircraft, the area between 30,000 and 40,000 feet is the sweet spot where the two factors balance out. You probably still aren't using a laptop from 1999, and your computer isn't flying at close to the speed of sound. Fortunately, planes have a much longer lifespan than computers. There are airliners from the early 1970s that are still just fine. They might not be able to keep up in terms of speed and fuel efficiency, but older planes are no less safe than their modern counterparts. Contrails, those white trails airplanes leave behind them at high altitudes, are easily mistaken for engine exhaust, but most are nothing more than water vapor. During a flight, moisture in the air collects in the engines before being vented with the exhaust. The hot, wet air leaving the engines mixes with the cool, dry air found at high altitudes, resulting in long, thin lines of vapor. Humidity determines when contrails form and how long they remain visible. Ever notice the numbers on the end of a runway? They're actually used to show the pilot which direction the plane is facing. For example, the number 36 is short for a heading of 360 degrees or due north. Along with numbers, the letters R and L indicate if the nearest runway is to the right or left. The lights on the tips of a plane's wings are called position lights or navigation lights, and they're used during times of reduced visibility. They help planes to see each other in the dark and can also tell pilots what direction an aircraft is traveling. The red light marks the tip of the left wing, while the green light is on the right. The third light is white and found on or near the tail. It might seem odd that the flight crew cares whether your window shades are up or down. The main reason is so that the passenger's eyes can adjust to the outside light. Mostly, it's just a matter of getting people on and off quickly. But in an emergency, the last thing they want is people stopping to blink before they evacuate the plane. There are so many ways to make airplanes safer. For example, they could have ejector seats so that every passenger could be rescued. In reality though, it's way more difficult than it sounds. If there were ejector seats, your trip would be very different. Everyone would have to be strapped into a seat with a harness to make sure they wouldn't fall out of it. Then you would have to wear an oxygen mask all throughout the flight. An emergency can occur at any time. Then, ejection in itself is a big pressure on your body. Even fighter pilots who are physically prepared can still suffer severe injuries. For an average person, this process wouldn't be safe. So, however cool it sounds, ejection seats aren't very practical and are actually quite dangerous. Okay, well, at least they could have a parachute for each passenger. But this wouldn't be very useful either. Parachutes only sound like they can save many lives. First, having them isn't efficient. They're very costly and heavy. So a plane would need to burn more fuel while flying if there were parachutes on board. It would all be worth it though if parachutes could make an actual difference to the safety of people, but they can't. Commercial planes aren't designed in a way that would make it safe to jump out of them, especially with a couple hundred people on board. Next, passengers aren't trained to use them. Imagine there's an emergency. The plane is falling, and 200 people are trying to deal with a parachute for the first time in their lives. It would be an absolute mess. Lastly, it's not safe to jump from the high altitudes planes fly at. So, oxygen masks, life vests, and boats are the best life-saving equipment, and every plane has those. You know those huge engines that they have under the wings? Yeah, look at them. They don't look safe at all. Birds can get pulled in, and it actually happens. They could at least put a grate in front of the rotating parts to prevent birds from getting in there. Turns out those engines pull inside huge amounts of air, and this is crucial for them to work properly. The more air gets swallowed, the more air gets compressed, mixed with fuel, and burned. And then, more of it gets pushed out from the other side, keeping the plane going. A cover at the front would be a barrier, significantly reducing the air inflow that is crucial for the proper work of the engines, and this would endanger the passengers. But hey, don't be too upset. Birds fly way lower than planes do, so they're only in danger for a few minutes at the beginning of the flight while the plane is climbing altitude, and at the very end when the plane is landing. So very few of them ever get pulled in, and if they do, it's never a threat to the engines or passenger safety. Planes also don't change up the gears like cars do, so technically they can't go backwards. The reason for this is that planes don't need to go backward. They can just turn around and move in the opposite direction, but face first. The only time when they need to move backward is when they have to get to the gate. And for those times, there's help. Pushback tractors. Those are small vehicles that can connect to airplanes and move them in the required direction. Watch out for those next time you fly. But technically speaking, planes can go backward if the engines start pushing the air forward instead of backward. But this is very dangerous for everyone around. One of the very few cases when they do it is during landing, to help slow the airplane down. There are cameras on the outside that let pilots navigate taxiways better. They come in especially handy during tricky maneuvering. But do you know there are also cameras in airplane cabins? You can relax, there are no cameras in the lavatories. But yes, they are there in the cabin, and for security reasons only. Flight attendants monitor them to see what's not visible from their own seats. Of course, flight attendants can check everything just by walking down the cabin, and that's exactly what they do most of the time. So, cameras are mostly used during takeoff and landing, when everyone, including flight attendants, is supposed to sit down, as those are the most dangerous stages of a flight. Notice that it's exactly during these stages that the rules are particularly strict. All electronic devices should be turned off or put on airplane mode, and big electronic devices should be stored away. Window blinds should be raised and tables folded. Seats should be put in the upright position. You need to have your seatbelt fastened, and so on. This is all done for safety and to ensure fast evacuation in case of emergency. So let's discuss these rules. Airplane mode on electronic devices is important to make sure that the signals that devices transmit don't interfere with the plane's electronic systems. If they interfere, they will block the radio's frequency pilots need to get their instructions. Do you remember that clicking sound a speaker makes right before your cell phone gets a call if the two devices are close? This is the sound pilots might hear while communicating with air traffic control. Now, putting away large devices like laptops is important because they might turn into obstacles if you need to get out of the plane fast in case of an emergency. All the pathways should be as clear as possible. This is why everything should be packed away, seats straightened, and tables folded. There should be nothing blocking anyone's way. And lastly, window blinds. The lights on the airplane get turned off too. Those two things are done to make sure your eyes get used to the natural light outside the aircraft. Imagine it's night, some emergency happens, and the lights that were left on suddenly go off. People need to evacuate as fast as possible, but their eyes aren't adjusted to the dark yet, and they can't see anything. This will slow everyone down. If the lights inside are out, people get used to the darkness and will be able to evacuate faster. The same goes for window blinds. If it's day and they are raised, people are used to the light outside and can evacuate faster. Another reason is that when blinds are raised during landing, people outside can see what's going on inside the plane. For example, if there's fire or smoke and where exactly. This way, they can plan the evacuation process better. Also, you might have noticed black triangles drawn above some windows on the airplane. These triangles mark the seats from which the view on the airplane's wings is the best. It's needed for the crew to find the spot as fast as possible if, in case of emergency, they need to inspect the engines, slats, or flaps. This little triangle saves the plane crew a lot of time. We do talk about emergencies a lot, but they really don't happen often. It's more dangerous to drive a car than to fly by plane, and most of us get in the car every day. Yet, the fear of flying is still very much out there, and people can get superstitious. In many cultures, the number 13 is considered unlucky. So, airplane companies that often fly to those destinations just omit row 13. It's a small thing to do, but it can spare a few anxious passengers who happen to sit in row 13. In other cultures, like in Italy and Brazil, 17 is the unlucky number, and some aircraft have both rows 13 and 17 missing. In airplanes that fly to China, they can often omit row 14 instead.
A plane with no identification marks is approaching the coast of Indonesia. It's not the most peaceful of times, and the flight operator is alarmed. Two fighter jets take to the sky, about to take down the unidentified plane. It's all about to end in a disaster, when the fighters notice one strange detail. December 1st, 1941. Captain of a Boeing 314, Robert Ford and his team are preparing for one of the longest flights on one of the biggest planes in the world. The Boeing 314 Clipper California is a high-capacity seaplane. It has no landing gear, so it can only land on water. Its length is 100 feet, and its wingspan is 150 feet. This is more than a 6-story building, and on board this plane, there is a restaurant, resting areas, and even a room with a bed. Despite its size, the Clipper California can stay in the air for more than 18 hours. Captain Ford doesn't suspect what is awaiting him ahead. He gets on the plane. Their flight is bound from San Francisco to Auckland, New Zealand. The first stop is Los Angeles. There's no problem with this. The next stop is Pearl Harbor. The flight is going fine. December 7th, 1941. It's been 3 days since the plane left Pearl Harbor. The last final step of the journey remains: flight to New Zealand. At this moment, Captain Ford receives an order to return the plane to the nearest Allied base. The way back is closed, so the plane continues to fly to Auckland. The Clipper lands safely at the Auckland airport and receives an order that seems impossible. Robert Ford and his team must paint over all the registration and identification marks on the plane and deliver it to LaGuardia, New York. Then, fly across the world. This is an uncharted route with a length of 23,000 miles. In the entire history of aviation at this time, no one has flown such a distance. The team doesn't have maps or modern navigation devices. They don't know the lands they will fly over. They don't know who they may meet on their way and at which airports they will land. They must maintain and repair the plane themselves, extract fuel, and plot the route. At the same time, they have almost no money. Immediately after receiving the order, the team goes to the Auckland Library. They study all the atlases and maps to create a detailed flight plan. First, they need to get to Australia, then fly to Africa along the coast of Asia, and then they should go to the US. The crew paint all over the signs on the plane and prepare for takeoff. Fortunately, before the start, one banker finds about their situation and gives them $500. The plane takes off. The team didn't notice they forgot to paint over the American flag. In a few days, it will save their lives. Before Australia, they fly to New Caledonia to evacuate a group of people from there and deliver them to Australia. The operation is successful. In Australia, the team needs to refuel the plane. They don't find special transport for Clipper services at that airport, so the crew themselves transport 800 cans of gasoline. And here's an important detail. The Boeing 314 doesn't use conventional fuel. It needs to be filled with special high-octane aviation gasoline. Early in the morning, the Clipper takes off and heads to Indonesia. The flight is going fine. They are approaching the airport. Meanwhile, the captain of the base where the Clipper is supposed to land notices an unidentified plane. He doesn't know who's flying it and from where. No one warned him about it. It may be an enemy plane. 2 fighter jets take to the sky. They are approaching the Clipper and don't see any identification marks on its body. The pilots are about to attack, but at that moment, they notice an American flag. If Robert Ford hadn't forgotten to paint it over, then everything would have ended badly for him and his crew. The fighters allow landing. The Clipper lands on the water. A boat floats towards it to meet the plane's crew, but stops. It turns out the plane landed on a place filled with sea mines, so the boat doesn't dare to sail there. The Clipper approaches the port and miraculously avoids contact with mines. Robert Ford and the crew of the plane are well met. They are going too quickly to rest and hit the road. But then, a big problem surfaces. The plane is running out of fuel, and at that naval base, there is only ordinary automobile gas. Nobody knows if the plane engine is going to go with it. It may burn out or stop working altogether, but there's no choice. They fill the tanks with ordinary fuel. Captain decides to take off using the remnants of aviation fuel, and during the flight, they switch to tanks with ordinary gasoline. When this happens, the plane's engine begins to clap and rattle, but after a while, it calms down. The flight continues. For 19 hours, they fly on dangerous fuel. Their next stop is Ceylon. The sky is covered with clouds. The pilot doesn't see the coast in the airport, so he decides to lower the plane below the clouds. They fly at an altitude of 300 feet above the surface of the sea and notice a huge whale ahead. The plane flies closer, and it turns out it's not a whale. It's an enemy ship. The Clipper begins to gain altitude to hide back into the clouds. Finally, they are again surrounded by a white veil. The booms and blasts are heard behind and below the plane. The Clipper's flying with zero visibility for 60 minutes. Finally, the clouds are clearing and they see the port of Ceylon. The team makes a short stopover and proceeds with its journey. As soon as the plane takes off, one of the engines explodes. Fortunately, they didn't have time to fly far from the port, so they successfully landed the plane on the water and repaired the engine. The Clipper continues its mission. Now, Robert Ford's team flies mainly over land. This is very risky, since the aircraft doesn't have landing gear and it can't safely land on solid ground. Finally, they get to the Congo. The team has a great time here, gains strength, rests, and most importantly, gets high-octane aviation gasoline. Things are going great, but there's another ordeal ahead. Now, the aviators will have to make the longest flight in their journey. Their next stop is a port town in Brazil, and the distance to it is 3,500 miles across the ocean. The maximum flight distance of the Boeing is 3,700 miles. Any deviation from the course or a strong headwind can easily prevent the aircraft from reaching the port. Worried, The crew refill the tank and load additional fuel onto the plane. They leave the Congo, taking off along the narrow river. At this moment, the pilot notices the river ends a few miles away with a waterfall. The plane must urgently gain altitude, but it can't. The large amount of additional fuel bears the Clipper down. The waterfall is getting closer. In the last seconds, the plane manages to rise to the desired height. But even after the waterfall, Boeing still doesn't get high enough. It hovers right above the rocky coastal cliffs. A slight inclination can lead to a crash. Fortunately, they manage to pass unharmed. The plane rises to the perfect height. During the flight from the Congo to Brazil, the crew broke a new record. It's 23 hours and 35 minutes in the air. The tired crew make a long-awaited landing in the city of Natal. However, the rest doesn't last long. 2 hours later, they take to the air and head to the next stop, an airbase in Panama. January 6, 1942, 5:54 a.m. The already legendary Boeing 314 is approaching LaGuardia, New York. The team can't wait to finish their journey. They contact the dispatch, and he tells them they can't land the plane only after 7 a.m., since the air terminal starts working at this time. For an hour, Robert Ford and his crew are circling in the air. It was probably the longest hour of their lives. Finally, the mission is complete. The Boeing 314 becomes the first passenger plane to make an almost around-the-world trip. This long flight lasted more than a month. This plane spent 209 hours or 8 days in the air. During this time, it covered more than 30,000 miles and made 18 landings.
Joseph Walker is about to have an historic flight, but he does not know of it yet. He smiles at his chase pilot, showing the OK sign, and closes the cockpit of his steel friend, the newest unpowered rocket plane, X-15. It's placed under the wing of a B-52 bomber. They take off and go up to 45,000 feet. Joseph is calm and full of joy because he has been getting ready for this moment his whole life. He trusts his steel-winged friend like no other. The bomber drops the X-15. The rockets fire up, and with a fantastic thrust, Joe flies steeply toward the edge of space. He knows his dream of making the first ever suborbital plane flight will soon come true. Joe adjusts the controls to intensify the rocket energy. In contrast to the usual blue sky plane view, the beautiful curved planet Earth view and a black horizon is a visual privilege only a few people can have. Joseph Walker's reaction shows he is experiencing zero gravity. "Welcome to space," the pilot says quietly. "We did it, guys." The Walker surname has always automatically propelled him to action. He just had to go forward, strive for higher results, and not stop. As a teenager, he loved to run, arms outstretched at the sides. He imagined that his legs lifted off the ground suddenly, and he felt himself flying, soaring up both as a man and an airplane. When he worked as a test pilot, he used to fly over city lights at dusk. They assembled themselves into gigantic mosaics below and reminded him of faraway stars he wanted to reach. His dream of becoming an astronaut and getting the astronaut wings, which he considered a great honor, was born at that time. On his way to his dream, Joe studied a lot and got a bachelor's degree in physics. He also had extensive test experience in the early X-series aircraft and 27 flights in rocket aircraft after joining the NACA, which stands for the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, in Dryden in 1951. He combined the experience with sound engineering judgment. What drives a test pilot to risk his life every day? Courage, duty, devotion, passion? All of it. Joe was a talented test pilot and would not have traded jobs with anyone, but he had always aimed higher. So he became the right person for the X-15 spaceflight program when he was invited to be its chief pilot. The whole team, including the engineers and all the 12 test pilots, had to prove that they could design an airplane that would fly and survive at hypersonic speeds. Before, there was only a theory about hypersonic flight and subscale wind tunnel testing. That's why there were many questions like, will they be able to prove it? Will they manage to design an airplane that will be stable and controllable at hypersonic speeds? Could they possibly create a structure that would survive the high heating rates associated with hypersonic speeds? And, more importantly, could a pilot survive and function adequately in this high-energy environment? When the X-15 launches from the bomber's wing, it first goes into a free fall for several seconds, and only after that the rockets can be ignited. So there was a considerable risk of a rocket failure too. The team also had to design an airplane that would be controllable outside the atmosphere and could successfully re-enter it at high speed and steep entry angles. If the X-15 took the wrong angle, the plane would be destroyed. So, could they prove all of this? To regularly tempt fate is a real job of any test pilot. Joseph knew the anatomy of his winged friend as much as his own because his life depended on it. The X-15 looked like a big propellant tank with a cockpit. It was 50 feet long, 20 feet wide, and 13 feet high. But the propellant tanks took up approximately 25 of those 50 feet. The X-15 weighed 15,000 pounds without propellants and 33,000 pounds loaded with them. The propellants consisted of liquid oxygen and anhydrous ammonia. To fly at the hypersound speed of Mach 6 or 4,000 miles per hour, one must have an airplane that will survive temperatures as high as 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. That's why the X-15 was built of steel Iconal X, a tough, high-strength nickel-steel alloy. Only 3 aircraft were built. The X-15 was by far the fastest plane existing at that time. It could fly at a speed of up to 7 times the speed of sound, which is 4,520 miles per hour. Joseph Walker could fly to the edge of space and land again within 12 minutes. The plane was powered by a liquid rocket engine Reaction Motors XLR-99, which delivered a powerful thrust of 57,000 pounds. During Walker's first X-15 flight, he was unaware of how much power the rocket motors had, and he was slammed into the pilot's seat yelling, "Oh wow!" The enormous ejection seat weighed 270 pounds. It had 2 large stabilizing fins deployed after ejection and 2 large telescopic booms that extended for seat stabilization. The aircraft had a conventional wing, although small, with only a 22-foot span and roughly 200 square feet of area. The aircraft's tail was unusual, with 2 canted horizontal and 2 vertical surfaces. These tail surfaces resembled the feathers on an arrow. They served the same purpose, keeping the aircraft stable and pointed in the right direction. The upper and lower vertical tail surfaces were pretty large and thick compared to conventional airplanes. They were wedge-shaped in cross-section with a sharp edge in front and a broad base at the rear. This provided additional stability and prevented the aircraft from swapping ends at extremely high speeds. The airflow sensor on the airplane's nose determined the airflow direction and impact pressure. This sensor was referred to as the ball nose. It was servo-driven to align with the airflow affecting the aircraft's nose. From this, the engineers obtained the angle of attack, the side slip inclination, and the impact pressure of the air flowing over the aircraft. The ball nose was cooled with liquid nitrogen to prevent it from melting during high-speed flight. Walker sometimes liked to playfully bet with his fellow test pilots who would be the first to lift the rocket plane above the Kármán line, the internationally accepted boundary of 62 miles. On August 22, 1963, during Flight 91, Joseph Walker sets a world record of the highest altitude of 67.08 miles reached by an unpowered plane X-15. The X-15 is hoisted up to the pylon on the B-52 wing. The hoists are located in the X-15 servicing, fueling, and mating areas. All pre-flight checks are completed. Takeoff. The X-15 is the first aircraft to utilize an inertial platform and a computer. Standard barometric instruments are almost useless in the X-15. Joseph has them on the instrument panel, but he only uses them during landing because they don't work at high altitudes or outside the atmosphere. For a sizable portion of the flight, he uses inertial data for control and guidance. Launch. The X-15 drops away from the bomber and gets into a free fall for several seconds. Then the rockets start by burning within 85 seconds, producing extreme power. Joseph pulls the plane up at a steep climb-out angle to start forming a long parabola and comes out of the atmosphere. The pilot has good visibility since the windows are next to his head. One very unusual thing about the visibility out of the X-15's windows is that the pilot cannot see any part of the airplane. He cannot see the nose, he cannot see the wings. Nothing. Typically, pilots use the nose and the wings in an aircraft for attitude reference. In the X-15, all Joseph has for a reference is the window frame, which is very disorienting on the one hand. But on the bright side, such a panoramic view is just right to enjoy the splendid horizon, a boundary between Earth and space. Joseph thinks how quiet it is here, like nowhere else. Mission completed. Joseph completes a perfect parabola and re-enters the atmosphere successfully. The X-15 is like a tough old bird that pops and bangs as it accelerates above extreme speed. But it all hangs together and gets Joseph Walker back home. He is ready to start a glide, landing from space. The X-15 has some outstanding features that significantly enhance the safety of landing. It has highly effective speed brakes, which are essential in an unpowered aircraft to adjust energy and ensure a pilot gets back to the ground safely. The more effective they are, the more precise the control of the power and the more accurate the landing. It's hard to imagine, but the pilot lands the X-15 only about 11 minutes and 8 seconds after its launch, having gone through the distance of 337 miles. Joseph Walker makes history as the first civilian test pilot flying to space by a rocket plane twice. Despite all the risks of the X-15 program, the courageous test pilots pushed the very limits of their piloting skills and physical health to master groundbreaking experimental technology. The program's overall success helped develop the Space Shuttle program and paved the way for NASA to continue to the Moon decades later. Joseph Walker got a lot of awards and the cherished astronaut wings, but only many years later. The Lunar Landing Research Vehicle, used to develop piloting and operational techniques for lunar landings, was trusted to be piloted by Joseph, and the famous moon crater Walker was named in his honor.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's the pilot of your plane speaking. Please fasten your seatbelts and stay calm. Don't worry, everything's fine. We're just falling! Ah! Okay, don't panic. Yes, we're falling, but the landing is gonna be great. And do you know why?
Because this is a video about the most incredible landings with happy endings. So, imagine this situation. You're in a giant passenger Boeing. The plane is flying from Montreal to Edmonton at an altitude of tens of thousands of feet. Weather is good. There's no turbulence. But then, you notice a strange silence. You don't understand what's happening. Exactly. The sound of engines is gone. And do you know why? Because they stopped working right in the air. The plane has run out of fuel. It'll take you a couple of minutes to get to the nearest gas station, if you fly straight down. It's a real accident that happened on July 23, 1983. That flight got nicknamed the Gimli Glider. During the fueling of the aircraft, the crew confused the measurements. They thought they were pouring American gallons, when it was actually liters. The pilots realized the mistake when they were already in the sky when the fuel had run out. They didn't panic and put the aircraft into the optimal mode to increase its flight range. One of them knew that the Gimli Air Force Base was nearby. There was a small runway there. At that moment, it was filled with some garbage and carts. The pilot contacted the base and warned them about the emergency landing. The employees of the base cleared the runway in a matter of minutes. The plane began to land very smoothly. The pilots controlled the aircraft by using its wings. They needed the last drops of fuel to brake with the help of turbines. When the plane touched down, the front landing gear broke. The landing was tough. The whole plane was shaking, and the passengers were terrified. But everything ended well. No one got hurt. On November 1st, 2011, a Polish Airlines 767 passenger plane was flying from the USA to Warsaw. 30 minutes after taking off, the pilots suddenly realized the landing gear didn't work. They warned the passengers about it. The wheels didn't come out because of some hydraulic error. Pilots remained calm and continued the flight. They almost reached the final destination and made several more attempts to deploy the landing gear. Nothing worked. They realized they would have to make a hard landing. When any airplane lands at this speed without wheels, it releases a lot of sparks, and its body heats up. because of friction with the ground. In this case, the chance of a fuel tank fire is high. That's why the pilots had to circle around the airport for about an hour to burn fuel. Then, when the tank was almost empty, they started landing without the landing gear. There were sparks, metal grinding against the runway, the cabin shaking. The lower part of the fuselage turned red because of the high temperature. After sliding for a while, the plane stopped. About 231 people on board were rescued, thanks to the pilot's professionalism. Probably one of the most famous emergency landings occurred on the Hudson River on January 15, 2009. Pilot Chesley Sullenberger became a hero that day. The plane he was flying collided with a flock of geese during its departure from New York. The engines were out of order. There was only icy water under the aircraft and almost no chance of salvation. Even now, experts say that the risk of crashing the plane was very high, but experienced Chesley Sullenberger knew what to do. He did his best to calm down, focused on his work, calculated the exact angle at which the plane needed to touch the water, and successfully landed the aircraft. If he had made the slightest mistake, the plane would have lost its wings and drowned almost immediately. Chesley Sullenberger saved the lives of 155 people and became a celebrity. There was one dangerous situation in the sky on June 10, 1990. Not for passengers, but for the pilot. Flight 5390 British Airways took off from England and headed for Spain. It was gaining altitude, and the flight attendants started serving food to the passengers. At that moment, the pilots heard some noise. Condensate began to fill the cabin. Then, the glass on the side of the captain flew out of the window frame. He was pulled halfway out of the cabin because of decompression. His knees got stuck in the control panel next to his seat. The first officer grabbed him tightly by the belt. The temperatures were extremely low, and an incredibly strong wind was blowing outside. The plane began to descend, gaining speed. The autopilot shut down. The flight attendants grabbed the captain so that the co-pilot could operate the controls with both hands. The oxygen level was decreasing, so he began an emergency landing. The captain was outside the plane for about 20 minutes, and despite the extreme conditions, he survived. The plane landed successfully. The captain was taken to the hospital, and the glass was replaced. Further investigation revealed that the window had flown out because the bolts used there had been wrong. A plane runs out of gasoline. The engines stall. An aircraft crashes into a flock of birds. That's all pretty scary stuff. But what if a plane broke in half? This really happened in April 2022. A DHL Boeing 757-200 cargo plane was picking up speed on the runway. It was going to fly to Guatemala. The aircraft took off, and the pilots noticed some malfunction in the hydraulic system. They didn't fly far away, so they asked the dispatchers to allow them to land. The plane turned around and began to descend, and at that moment, its tail just broke off. The plane ran off the runway. Its hull was hot, but firefighters poured anti-fire foam on it just in time. Fortunately, none of the crew members got hurt. What caused such an accident is unknown. The company launched an internal investigation. The next hard landing occurred in the 40s. The pilot and 2 crew members were flying over Papua New Guinea. Visibility was poor because of fog and rain. But, according to the pilot's calculations, they were flying above a wheat field. He began to lower the plane. The clouds cleared, and he saw not a field, but a swampy area. They had no choice but to make a hard landing. It was a success, kind of. All 3 crew members survived, but the plane got bogged down in a swamp. It was impossible to take off, so the crew went to look for the nearest settlement. For 2 days, they were walking through the swamps, sharp tall grass, and hordes of mosquitoes. Exhausted, they reached dry land and met one of the locals. They helped the crew, took them to the village, and provided medical help. The plane was left to rot in the swamp, forgotten. It stayed there for about 30 years. Its whole body got covered with grass, mud, and moss. And the cabin was moldy. The locals loved to climb inside and play with it. Then, in the 70s, some tourists from Austria accidentally found the aircraft. They took a photo of the plane and published it in the local newspaper. It attracted the attention of many photographers and travelers from all over the world. They called the plane the Swamp Ghost. Many tourists visited it and took parts of the plane as souvenirs. In 2016, one American traveler pulled it out of the swamp and moved it to his home.
Okay, shocker. Airplanes don't take off with the wind, but actually against it. I'd think that if you take off with the wind, it pushes you forwards and helps you fly faster, but this is wrong. So I did some digging for us. We should think of an airplane as a kind of kite. To make a kite fly, you launch it against the wind, and so it flies. Here's how it works. There are 4 forces of flight: lift, weight, thrust, and drag. The lifting force is generated because of the differences above and below the kite. Above the kite, the speed of air is higher than below it. So, the pressure below is higher than that of the pressure above, and the kite is pushed forwards. This is the lifting force. There's also an opposing force, the force generated by gravitation that pushes the object down. That one is called weight. The thrust is the force that pushes the object forward. In the case of a kite, it's generated by the string, the wind, and the forward motion you're making. In the case of an airplane, the thrust force is generated by the engines. Finally, drag is the opposing force of thrust. So, to launch a kite into the air, the lifting force must be greater than that of the force of weight. Then, to stay in the air, all 4 must stay in balance. Lift must be equal to weight, thrust must be equal to drag. The moment the plane takes off, going against the wind helps to generate the needed lifting force faster. Yes, going against the wind does decrease the ground speed of an aircraft, but that's not the speed we need. An airplane flies due to the speed of air flowing over the wings. This airflow isn't generated by the plane's engines, but by the wind. And the higher the airflow, the higher the lift. Going against the wind increases the flow of air over the aircraft's wings, giving it an additional lift and allowing it to achieve a higher altitude in less time because it takes off at a greater angle. The same works for landing. Landing against the wind lets a pilot to descend at a shorter distance in a shorter time. The airflow and the lifting force are the things that are responsible for turbulence. The direction and speed of the wind, and therefore the airflow, isn't constant over time. Sometimes it changes pretty quickly, like 100 times per second. So one moment there's more lift, and the other moment there's less lift, and then the plane is shaking. This is called the turbulence zone. It's not dangerous at all, it just means that you fly through the zone of a highly constant wind, and that's all. So if a pilot is given the option of how to take off, they'd pick to take off into the wind. It's not always the case, and it's not a problem taking off with the wind, but going into it helps a lot. Many airports are designed so that most runways are taking the direction opposing the most typical wind direction of the area. Also, taking off and landing are the most dangerous stages of any flight. That's because the pilot has less time and space to react to any occurring problems. In the air, even if both engines stopped working, a plane won't just start falling. Instead, it'll start gliding through the sky, losing about 1 mile of altitude for every 10 of them going forward. So, the pilot will have about 8 minutes to react and find a safe place to land. During takeoff and landing, the time is limited. If an engine fails, the pilot will have seconds to decide if they should still take off and deal with the problems in the air or cancel the flight. The thing is that canceling isn't even always possible, even if something happens. If the plane has already reached a speed of 100 miles per hour, it can't possibly be stopped before the runway ends. Physics. And getting out of the runway isn't good. Flying is costly, so not only the passengers, but the airline as well wants to make the flight as fast and short as possible. So there's no surprise here, there's always the most efficient way to go from point A to point B. And the shortest way is, of course, a straight line. Now, look at some aircraft routes. These don't exactly look straight, but don't let this trick you. We have to keep in mind that the Earth isn't flat like we see on a map. It's a sphere. So these lines only appear like arcs when we project them on a map. In reality, they're pretty much straight. If there's an efficient way, this means that every airline and every plane wants to fly this way. But there are hundreds of planes going from North America to Europe every day, and many go at the same time. Turns out, the air highway is pretty busy. So how come the planes never collide? That's because before a flight starts, the crew make a strict flight plan that is uploaded to the aircraft's computer, and that pilot will have to follow. To be completely honest, there are several of them, just to have options if something goes wrong. What helps to avoid any colliding is that the airspace is three-dimensional, and the planes don't only fly in several lines as cars, but also at different altitudes. Air traffic is managed by dispatchers who watch for planes and control that they don't get closer to each other than 3 miles. There's also flight level regulations. All the westbound flights fly at even-numbered altitudes, like for example 34,000 feet or 36,000 feet, and all eastbound flights fly at odd-number altitudes, like 35,000 feet and 37,000 feet. This means that there's a couple of thousand feet between the planes flying in the same direction. To share the sky safely, each aircraft has to follow their own airway that even has a specific name. There are also some parts of the air that are especially busy, having remarkably high traffic because many planes fly there every minute. So, whenever an aircraft enters a busy zone, it has to stick to a very specific route. So, usually, commercial aircrafts fly on the altitude between 31,000 and 38,000 feet. This altitude is reached within the first 10 minutes of the flight. So, why so high? With height, the air gets thinner, so the plane faces less resistance and can fly faster and burn less fuel. Another reason that they fly so high is that the plane avoids most of the weather patterns that usually happen way lower. High winds and rain happen in the troposphere, the atmospheric layer that is closest to the ground. Planes fly just a little bit above, but already in the next layer, the stratosphere. Since most of the weather phenomenon are avoided, the flight is smoother and there's less turbulence. But then why don't they fly even higher? Remember the force of weight that pushes the object down. An aircraft is very heavy, and the more you weigh, the harder it is to get higher, because the force is stronger. To push it even higher, more fuel will be needed, and that's inefficient. Also, the oxygen becomes too sparse to fuel the engines, so the planes usually fly the most efficient way, high enough to avoid the weather patterns, but not much higher so that they don't spend too much fuel. If you've ever flown, you've probably noticed those little holes on the windows. An airplane window has 3 panes of plexiglass. That tiny hole is only in the one that's in the middle. It exists to regulate the huge pressure difference inside and outside the cabin. This way, the outer plane can handle the load. If the outer pane breaks, the middle one will keep the window intact. Also, that hole also keeps the windows from fogging up. Have you noticed that whenever you enter the plane, you enter it from the left side? It's not random. Firstly, the captain usually sits on the left side of the airplane cabin, so it's easier for the captain to align the plane with the terminal jet bridge from that side. Also, the aircraft is fueled and loaded with the baggage on the right side. With passengers loading the plane from the left side, the crew can do their job undisturbed.
Each airplane carrying over 19 passengers must have a crash axe. You will see it installed as a firefighting device. That way, if there's an electrical fire, crew members can cut away the cockpit or some other panels. The pilots can actually break the windscreen if something bad happens and people need to evacuate. Passenger planes are mostly white to protect them from solar radiation and its effects. Aircrafts need to remain cool at airports in particularly hot countries, while passengers are going in or out. Brilliant white paint can bounce the sunlight back. It also protects some parts of the plane that are made of composite materials and prevents their damage since there's higher ultraviolet radiation at high altitudes. Commercial planes must get to speeds of at least 155 miles per hour to achieve stability and safety at takeoff. Some smaller planes can sustain altitude even at speeds of 30 miles per hour. But when speeds are that low, the plane can easily get destabilized and could even fail the takeoff. The white trails that planes leave behind, also known as contrails, are created because of water vapor. Vapor is produced during the combustion of fuel in plane engines. When the plane reaches its cruising altitude of 32,800 feet, temperatures get quite low, about -67 degrees Fahrenheit. It's really cold. So, the water turns into particles of ice. How long these particles are going to remain visible mostly depends on humidity. The higher the level of humidity is, the bigger those trails get and remain visible even long after the plane has disappeared. Airplanes all over the globe get struck by lightning almost on a daily basis. A regular airplane in commercial service gets hit on average once a year. How often it happens depends on a couple of things. First, how many landings and takeoffs the plane performs, since lightning mostly strikes at heights between 5,000 and 15,000 feet. It also depends on location. For instance, it's more likely for a plane to get struck by lightning around the equator and in some other parts of the world. Modern planes are designed to withstand such strikes. They have to go through special lightning tests to prove they can cope with strikes. Planes mostly fly at altitudes of up to 7 miles. There are some benefits like the thinner air or producing less aerodynamic drag, which also means less fuel consumption. The temperatures up there are lower, which makes the jet engines more efficient. That part of the atmosphere is also less turbulent, which helps make flights smoother. Some planes have already gone into space, but not the ones you see at the airport. Those classical planes need air to go up, and space is basically just a vacuum. The first plane that reached space was designed around 70 years ago. During its first flight, it generated lift and stability using its thin, stubby wings. It traveled more than 5 times the speed of sound. There are at least 1 sextillion planets out there in our universe. To give you an idea of how huge this number is, our planet weighs almost 1 sextillion times more than some animals like a bear. None of these planets are cubic, triangular, or any other shape. They're all round. At its beginnings, a planet is just a cloud of dust and rocks that rotates around a central star. Dust and small pieces attract each other because of gravity, and they keep doing it until they form a blob. Now, the blob starts attracting more matter. It grows and gets bigger until it's done with collecting everything in its path. Gravitational forces work equally in all directions, so that blob gets a round shape. But not the perfect one. Our planet, for instance, is almost a sphere, but with a bulge in the middle. The bulge is there because the Earth is spinning. Every time it rotates on its axis, the middle part travels further than the top. The area at the equator is moving quicker than the area at the poles. And the faster you spin something, the more you'll throw it outwards. Sound will travel 4 times faster in water than in air. It's a wave, and that's why it moves faster in a denser substance. Particles that are close to each other, as in denser substances, will bump into each other more easily. Water is denser. There are 800 times more particles in a bottle of water than in the same sized bottle filled with air. Bubbles are round because they occur in a thin film, such as one of soapy water traps air. The molecules in the film attract each other. That way, they stick together and also shape a sphere, because that's the smallest possible area that encloses any given volume. They can't get any smaller because they have trapped air inside. You can turn your pencil into a diamond. If you apply a temperature of 2,550 degrees Fahrenheit and pressure of 55,000 atmospheres, you can transform graphite into diamond. There are actually 2 variations of a single chemical element, carbon. Diamonds aren't just used in jewelry, but for different purposes. For example, as a cutting tool for electronic devices. Beavers are amazing builders capable of creating cool and complex riverside structures. They build them to protect themselves from wild animals that might go after them, like wolves or bears. But not in the way it may look at first. Beavers don't really live in their dams. They only use them as a barrier, making some sort of a pool or pond of deeper water. That's where their real home is, in the pool. It's like a small island or dome lodge. It's a dry area where beavers are safe. They can also store their food there. These pools are deep enough for land animals to avoid them. Beavers dig underwater tunnels that are entrances into their home. If a predator or some other danger is coming, they can quickly escape to safety. Some animals sleep while standing. Zebras, elephants, horses, some birds like flamingos. Cows can sleep while standing, but they prefer to lie down when they want to rest. To sleep while standing, animals need to have legs that can align vertically. That way, they don't have to activate their muscles to keep them standing. Their knees also lock in place. It's better for these animals to sleep while standing because they'd probably be too slow to react if there was a predator going after them. When we laugh in some unpleasant situations, or when we feel nervous, we're actually trying to mask our true emotions. For example, you do something embarrassing and try to cover up the shame you feel. Also, we're more relaxed after laughing, so if you're nervously chuckling in an unpleasant situation, it can help you clear some of your negative emotions. When you buy a bottle of water, you can see it has an expiration date. It's not that the water inside will turn bad. The expiration date is there because the plastic may start to leach into the water over time and contaminate it with chemicals that might be bad for us. The moon has its own time zone. The astronomers created a special watch for all moonwalkers. It measures time in lunations, which is the period of time the moon needs to rotate and revolve around our planet. Each lunation is almost 30,000 Earth days. You can decaffeinate your coffee if you take it into a sauna to moisten the green coffee bean within temperatures of 160 to 210 degrees Fahrenheit. The point is to get 10 milligrams or less of caffeine per one coffee. That's when you can put it in the decaf category. One serving of regular coffee has 50 to 75 milligrams of caffeine. There's a reason the Earth spins. Our solar system formed 4.5 billion years ago. There was a raging cloud of dust and gas. Molecules and atoms in that cloud had a tendency to rotate in a certain direction. That same cloud collapsed under gravitational forces. Gravity magnified its initial rotation and then flattened it out into a disk. Our planet formed within that disk, and now it's spinning because of that old pattern of its parent cloud.
A shadow is cast when you have an object in the path of light. Light travels in a straight line, which is why you always get a shadow when something's in front of a light source. Birds and airplanes are no exception. They do cast shadows, but we can't see them. The closer the object to a source of light, the denser its shadow, and vice versa. If the object is too far away, its shadow disperses. A commercial airplane flies at 35,000 to 40,000 feet. At such a height, you barely see the plane, let alone its shadow. It's too far from the Earth's surface, so its shadow is scattered, and you can't see it. The same goes for birds. But if there was a giant asteroid passing by the Earth, you'd see its shadow, based on the same principle by which lunar and solar eclipses work. A solar eclipse is when the moon is directly between the Earth and the sun, blocking the sun's rays. That casts a shadow on some parts of the Earth. The moon is 400 times smaller than the sun, but it's also 400 times closer to our planet than the star, which is why they seem the same size in the sky. But since the moon is smaller, its shadow is not big enough to cover the whole Earth, so it's only cast to some parts of it. Lightning is never a triangle, straight line, or circle. It has a zigzag shape. Lightning is an electric current, like those you have in your house, except this one is much more powerful. It always takes the path of least resistance. There are lots of things in the air, like dust particles, gases, and other substances, so it's uneven and irregular. Let's say you have a mound of sand. When you pour water, it won't flow downward in a straight line, but in specific patterns, seeking the best way through the sand. The same happens with lightning. Antarctica has icebergs that look like giant ocean waves frozen in motion. Despite their appearance, these formations are created over long periods of time. The ice got lifted, compacted, and shaped by the wind and other elements, accidentally taking the wave shape in the end. Blood Falls is a glacier in Antarctica that pours out some sort of red liquid that looks like blood. Scientists say it happens because there's a salty lake with a large iron content under the glacier. Salt water freezes at a lower point than fresh water, so it melts the ice above, letting the river flow. This is the coldest glacier on our planet, which is why the water can constantly flow without melting it. And the red color is because of the iron in the water. Antarctica is the only continent where you can't find reptiles. They're cold-blooded, which means they depend on heat from their environment to keep their bodies warm and can't survive in cold, icy regions such as Antarctica. Penguins can relax. No snakes or crocodiles to bother them there. Only a quarter of the Sahara territory is sand. There are mountains and oases, but most of the desert is covered in gravel. And it's not the biggest desert on Earth. Antarctica is. Just like people, trees also stop growing at a certain age. Scientists think this could be because when a tree gets old and reaches a certain height, it has trouble pulling water from the soil and pumping it all the way to the top because of gravity. Some trees, like the baobab, start growing out instead of up when they get to their full height. The baobab expands up to 0.4 inches every year. Australia is atop of one of the world's fastest moving tectonic plates. It moves 2.5 inches northward every year, which is about the rate our fingernails and hair grow. If you feel like trying to find something to watch on TV is just wasting your life, studies agree. The average person spends 1.3 years flipping between channels and trying to find something worthy of their attention. You can see a rainbow at night, too. It's a rare phenomenon called a lunar rainbow, or moonbow, and it appears when moonlight is reflected and dispersed through moisture and water droplets in the atmosphere. Lunar rainbows mostly occur in areas with high rainfall, or even near waterfalls surrounded by mist. When you crack an egg on land, it can turn into a mess, but 60 feet under the ocean, there's 2.8 times the atmospheric pressure on the egg, which is why it holds together like there's an invisible shell, and looks like some sort of weird jellyfish. Stars don't actually twinkle. Their light is constant and steady, but when it interferes with Earth's atmosphere, it bumps and bounces through the air, which bends the light. Different layers of air are constantly moving, which changes the bending of the light too, so it looks like twinkling. Hudson Bay, Canada is the area where gravity is lower than in other parts of our planet. It's not like people there are free-floating like in space, but it may feel like some sort of a natural geographical diet. Lower gravity leads to less density, so you'd weigh less there than anywhere else. Gravity depends on the density of the Earth, so it's uneven. When the last ice age hit, Hudson Bay was covered by a 2-mile thick glacier. It was heavy, so it kept pushing down on the rock underneath it. Over 20,000 years ago, the glaciers began to melt, but the Bay region was left deformed due to heavy ice that used to be there. The only sport someone played on the moon was golf. In 1971, an astronaut went to the moon and hit 2 golf balls, sending them flying through the low-gravity atmosphere on the lunar surface. The Great Wall of China is 5,000 miles long, so it would take you about 18 months to walk its length. Contrary to popular belief, you can't see it from space with your bare eyes. Lobsters are not biologically immortal. They age through time, but also produce a special enzyme that's in charge of repairing their cells. It also replicates their DNA indefinitely, so they can live for a very, very long time. If you went to the deepest part of the ocean, you'd feel an incredibly strong pressure, more than 8 tons per square inch, which is like having 50 jumbo jets lying on top of you. The sun is the biggest object you can find in our solar system. While there are so many rocky planets, gas giants, asteroids, and dwarf planets, the sun still makes up 99.8% of the total mass of our system. The sun is in the most stable stage of its life cycle at the moment, but in around 5 billion years, it will run out of hydrogen, its fuel. We can see sunsets because the atmosphere of our planet acts like a prism. Science calls it scattering. There's more distance between us and the sun at the time of sunset, meaning more particles and molecules are in the air. They scatter some of the short wavelength violet and blue light off in different directions. This process happens millions of times before the beam of sunlight gets to our eyes, and that's when we see some other colors of the spectrum, such as orange or yellow. Tsunamis can reach a speed of more than 500 miles per hour, which is as fast as a jet plane. They retain the energy, which means they can move across the ocean and almost not lose energy at all until they reach the shore. Octopuses are some of the most intelligent creatures in the sea. They navigate through mazes, solve problems, and have pretty good short-term memory. Scientists believe they're so smart because they live a pretty dynamic life. They move fast, hide in unpredictable places, expand across new habitats, move in unusual patterns, and let their tentacles into crevices for food. This is all challenging enough for their brain to develop all the time. The famous heads, known as Maui statues on Easter Island, have bodies too. They're just hidden beneath the surface. There are also 900 Maui statues on the island. Scientists discovered New Zealand is part of a larger landmass that lies under the water. 94% of the total land is under the surface. It's called Zealandia and is considered to be a microcontinent. Maybe it'll even be the 8th on the list someday. So you take off from New York Airport and head to London. You gain altitude, and then you are sharply pressed into the back of your seat. You can feel the plane picking up more and more speed, and then, boom! The plane is fine. That boom simply means that you've passed the speed of sound, and you're now traveling faster than 761 miles per hour. At that speed, a trip across the Atlantic Ocean to London takes about 5 hours. By comparison, conventional subsonic planes, like the Boeing 747, can cross the ocean in about 8.5 hours. Right now, we have a non-commercial supersonic aircraft. One of the most famous planes is the Lockheed SR-71. It was as long as a limo and weighed like 10 SUVs. This plane holds the world's record for speed in the air. It was able to reach 2,193 miles per hour. At that speed, it could circle the globe in 10 hours, and it covered our route from New York to London in just 1 hour and 54 minutes. So traveling at the speed of sound seems like a great idea. Sometimes you spend up to 3 hours a day in a traffic jam just to get to work. Imagine if you could travel between continents in that time. The Concorde supersonic plane was supposed to do it. This plane was as long as half a soccer field and had a wingspan the size of a basketball court. The empty Concorde weighed almost twice as much as a Boeing 737, and it could carry about 100 passengers. The Concorde could go over twice the speed of sound, but it required an incredible amount of fuel. The flagship of transatlantic flights, the double-decker Boeing 747, burned 1 gallon of fuel for 80 miles per passenger. Concorde burned 1 gallon for only 17 miles per passenger. Given fuel prices, Concorde tickets cost almost 5 times as much as a regular plane, and although it could fly almost twice as fast, it was not allowed to do so. It's all about the sonic boom. When an airplane passes the speed of sound, a shock wave appears on its nose and tail. These waves merge into one and then reach the ground. And this supersonic boom doesn't just appear at the very moment when the plane gets to supersonic speed. It appears continuously. So when the Concorde flew at top speed, it made a sound similar to the constant beating of drums. And to feel this level of noise, put your ear to the wall and ask your friend to start drilling the wall from the other side. So naturally, Concorde was forbidden to fly faster than the speed of sound over land, and it only used its full power when flying over the ocean. When we travel, we spend a lot of time driving to the airport. Then we go to check-in, go through passport control, and wait for boarding. Then we go through passport control in another country, pick up our luggage, and drive to our destination. It all takes a lot of time, and flying at high speed doesn't bring that much change. So Concorde was inefficient, expensive, and noisy. Before long, supersonic airplanes went on the shelf for several decades. But maybe they'll be back soon. Ariane AS-2. It's a private supersonic jet in development. It's as long as 3 school buses and has a wingspan almost like a Concorde. It can reach a speed of about 925 miles per hour and will be able to cover the distance from New York to Los Angeles and back. Modern engines have made it more fuel efficient and less noisy, but the supersonic boom is still a problem. NASA is developing the X-59 Quest experimental aircraft to study how to deal with supersonic waves. The plane is slightly longer than a train car and with a wingspan as long as a limousine. It's expected to fly at 940 miles per hour at an altitude of 55,000 feet. That's 1.5 times higher than conventional commercial airplanes fly. Its narrow shape and small wings near the cockpit should prevent sound waves from appearing, and the long distance to the ground should give the sound waves time to slow down. Engineers expect the volume of the supersonic boom on the ground to be about 60 decibels. That's 1,000 times quieter than Concorde, and it won't feel like a drill behind a wall, but like the noise of a washing machine. If engineers solve the problem of loud noise and allow the planes to fly at supersonic speeds above the ground, they'll be able to fly from New York to Los Angeles in 2.5 hours instead of 6 hours of a regular flight. The price of an aircraft like the Aviation AS2 will start at $120 million. That's 12 times more than a Cessna CJ4, for example, which uses less fuel and can take just as many people on board. But the huge Airbus A320 has been known to be bought as a private jet for $500 million. So if your time is valuable and you want to spend less time in the air, you can buy yourself a supersonic plane. The next supersonic passenger candidate is the Spike S512 supersonic business jet. It's a twin-engine airplane almost as long as a Boeing 737 with a 58-foot wingspan. And it's much faster than the Aviation AS2. The Spike has a top speed of about 1,100 miles per hour. That's 450 miles per hour faster than conventional planes. The manufacturers promise that the aircraft can travel from New York to London in 3 to 4 hours, New York to Tokyo in 6 hours instead of 12, New York to Alaska in 3 hours instead of 6, and New York to Dubai in 6.5 hours instead of 12. The V-shaped wings and the long, narrow fuselage make it possible. Another important aerodynamic feature is the lack of portholes. Not to make passengers sit in the dark, there are TV panels all around the interior. These screens will show images from the cameras around the aircraft, so you'll see the same view you could see from an airplane window. But the Spike can only hold 18 passengers. This is where boom technologies come in. Their plane is very similar to the Concorde with its wings and long fuselage. It can hold up to 55 passengers. 2 engines are placed on the wings, and 1 more is in the tail. They will propel the plane to more than 1,100 miles per hour. These are turbofan engines, like conventional airplanes, so they won't use afterburners, and they won't make much noise. An afterburner is used in engines to create extra thrust. The fuel may not burn completely in the engine, and the exhaust gas can still burn. So it's ignited again, and you can see the fire just behind the airplane's engine. With engines like that, it would be 25% of the cost of maintaining this airplane over the Concorde. A new version of this plane might be able to carry 68 to 88 passengers. Boom makers expect ticket prices to be the same as a regular business class flight. So far, supersonic airplanes make too much noise, so they can only use all their power over water. Considering that there are about 1,750 flights every day over the Atlantic Ocean alone, supersonic planes can save time for travel. If you're looking for a plane that will fly completely silently, then you should take a look at electric planes, such as the Aviation Alice. It's a private plane that's equipped with 3 electric engines. It takes off and lands without the noise of fuel-burning engines and doesn't need long runways. So airports for private planes can be located right in the center of the city. It would significantly reduce travel time to the airport. Also, Aviation Alice is incredibly cheap to maintain. $200 for an hour of flight time compared to $1,000 for the same time in traditional private jets. The disadvantages of this plane are speed and range. On a single charge, the Aviation Alice can travel about 620 miles. That's like flying from New York to Detroit. And its top speed is only 253 miles per hour. That's slower than some sports cars. Half of all flights in the world are under 500 miles. so this electric plane could be an excellent replacement for giant fuel-burning airplanes. We just need to set up a network of airports and charging stations for them. It can be done at about 2,000 abandoned airports. There, you would board the plane like a bus, and it would take you to your destination.
A TikTok user was flying home from New York City to Toronto, Canada, late at night and noticed one strange thing that turned into a viral video. She glanced at her neighbor's screen, which showed 27°C, which is around 80 degrees Fahrenheit in the corner. Then, she saw that the person in front of them had 26°C, closer to 79, on their screensaver. Since the rest of the screensaver was a tropical landscape, she figured out it must be the destination temperature in Celsius. But nope, she was heading to Toronto in late October, far from tropical dreams. So what did that temperature stand for, and why on earth was it different for different seats? It took her a while to realize that the numbers and letters actually stood for passengers' seat locations. Plenty of fellow TikTok users supported the video's author and said that they had to read the comments to figure out what was going on. It's actually not so wrong. The aircraft is usually divided into several zones. Each of them normally has its own air conditioning system controller. These gadgets look similar to home thermostat panels, except every panel has separate dial settings for each cabin zone. So there can totally be slightly different temperatures depending on where you're sitting on the plane. But crew members mostly set the temperature somewhere between 71 degrees Fahrenheit and 75 degrees Fahrenheit to make you feel at home. This is the temp you're most likely to set on your AC at home, right? And because all people have different body temperatures, the airplane crew mostly aims for the lower end of that spectrum, especially during morning and afternoon flights in the summer. Feeling a bit chilly is definitely better than sweating, as stuffy air makes it harder for passengers to breathe. And those who have motion sickness might feel even worse in a warm temperature while flying through turbulence. Conditioned air from the cabin also goes into the cargo hold in the belly of the plane. It gets a little cooler by the time it reaches there. Plus, the cargo area is less insulated than the cabin, so it's mostly around 44 degrees Fahrenheit in a Boeing 767 cargo hold. The bulk area where pets are traveling can get as warm as 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Depending on the plane's position, it comes from three main sources. When a plane is parked at the gate, it often uses air from the ground. This air, called preconditioned air (PCA), comes from a big air conditioning machine on the ground. You might notice a big yellow tube connected to the plane. This is how the ground air gets inside. Sometimes a gas-powered air car can be used instead. Ground air is usually powered by electricity, which is cheaper, cleaner, and quieter than running the plane's engines. But it doesn't always keep the cabin cool enough, especially on hot days or if the tube gets kinked. Cities like Las Vegas and Phoenix, which have very hot weather, have some of the best ground air systems in the US to handle the heat. The second source of air aboard is the APU, or Auxiliary Power Unit. It's like a mini engine in the tail of the plane. It's the second option for cooling or heating the cabin, especially if ground air isn't available. The APU can work even on the hottest days. During quick stops, the APU might stay on the whole time to keep the air inside comfortable. If the plane is preparing to leave the gate, the APU gets switched on just before the ground air is disconnected. The plane's main engines can also provide air for the cabin. This happens when the engines are running, usually after pushback or during the flight. The engines can keep the cabin cool or warm while also managing the plane's pressurization. If the cabin feels too hot or cold, pilots can fix it if they start the engines early. If not, they can use other sources of air. This might not always work, especially when the temperatures are going up and planes get extra hot just sitting on the runway. One flight attendant shares the story of how she felt hot, dizzy, confused, and then blacked out aboard. Another flight in Florida was delayed an hour because it was 93 degrees inside the cabin. The gate agent told the passengers they had to wait for it to drop to at least 85 degrees to board the plane safely. The sun wasn't even up yet at that time. Sadly, the external AC units and the auxiliary-powered cooling systems don't always work properly because of maintenance issues. You can increase your chances of feeling comfortable on the flight if you look up the flight number and what type of plane it uses. Newer planes will have more advanced onboard technology. Some will even have temperature regulation by now. So you'll only have to fight a couple of neighbors to get to the temperature you prefer. But then there's also the cost control problem. Some airlines make their pilots save money on fuel and maintenance and won't let them use the auxiliary power unit and other engines while the plane is at the gate or on the runway. If they use too much fuel for AC on the ground, they might have to refuel later on. Another big problem with hot weather is how it affects takeoff. Planes are very heavy and gravity pulls them down to the ground. To get into the sky, they need lift, which is the force that opposes the weight of the airplane and holds it in the air. When the air gets hotter, it expands, which means there are fewer air molecules to push the plane upward. For every rise of 5.4 degrees Fahrenheit, an airplane loses about 1% of its lift. So, in really hot weather, it can be much harder for planes to take off, and if it gets too hot, it might even be impossible. The problem is especially tricky at airports in high places, where the air is already thinner, and at airports with short runways, which give planes less time to speed up. For example, at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, a plane might need a runway that's 6,500 feet long to take off. But if it's 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the same plane would need 8,200 feet of runway. In 2018, because of a heat wave in London, they had to remove passengers from 14 flights. It happened at London City Airport, which has shorter runways than other airports in the area. So they have to take off at a steeper angle. It would have been impossible if the plane had been loaded to the max, and they would have had to use a lot of extra fuel to make it fly. On one flight, they had to ask 20 passengers to stay behind. Since no one volunteered not to fly to Ibiza, they had to choose them at random. This made the plane lighter and let it take off safely. Scientists have also noticed that headwinds that help the plane take off have slowed down by about 2.3 knots every decade. It reduced the maximum takeoff weight for planes. If you're more worried about the cold than the heat, there's some good news for you. Since planes fly at almost 40,000 feet above the ground, they can perfectly survive freezing temps of around negative 70 degrees Fahrenheit. They keep the fuel warm on the ground, and once the plane is flying, the engine heats it up, so it works perfectly even in the icy skies. Cold air actually helps planes fly better because it's denser than warm air, which means they can take off more quickly and fly more efficiently. But cold weather has its challenges, like ice and snow. If snow or ice sticks to important parts of the plane, like the wings, it can mess up the smooth airflow that helps the plane fly. To fix this, ground staff sprays the wings with heated antifreeze liquid to melt the snow and ice. When the plane is flying, the wings stay ice-free because the engine's hot air warms them up and the plane's speed prevents snow from sticking.
This could have been one of the biggest disasters in aviation history. It was close to midnight at San Francisco International Airport when Air Canada Flight 759 approached for landing. The pilots were almost done for that day and thought they'd land as usual, but they were unaware that the airport looked different that night. Runway 28 right was open, while runway 28 left, usually parallel, was closed for maintenance, with its lights turned off. Despite having landed here before, the pilots made a critical error. Expecting to see two parallel runways, they mistook the center runway for the darkened 28 left and assumed the taxiway on the right was 28 right. What the crew didn't realize was that the taxiway wasn't empty. 4 planes were lined up there, waiting for takeoff, with more than 1,000 passengers in total, and their plane was headed straight toward them. There was a notice to airmen, which listed important details for flights, including this critical information. But these notices are long and dense, often stretching several pages, and the closure detail had been missed by the Air Canada crew. That night, the pilots were conducting a visual approach, relying on what they could see to align with the runway. This is normal in good weather, but is much harder at night. The crew had flown from Toronto and were tired after a long day. Their internal clocks were already past 3 a.m., and Canadian rules regarding pilot rest were less strict than those in the U.S. The captain had been working for nearly 19 hours without proper rest. As the plane got closer to danger, no one in the cockpit noticed they were on the wrong path. Planes approaching San Francisco often come in at a slight angle to reduce noise over the bay. It's normal for them to appear slightly off to air traffic controllers. But this added to the confusion, and the Air Canada crew kept heading toward the taxiway. When the pilots finally realized that something was off, they radioed the control tower to confirm their landing clearance. The controller, who was managing both air traffic and ground operations due to the late hour, took several seconds to respond. He cleared them to land, unaware that the plane was lined up for the wrong path. Meanwhile, the crew of one of the planes on the runway quickly radioed the tower, alerting them to the imminent danger. The tower immediately instructed the Air Canada crew to stop and go around for another attempt. The Air Canada pilots pulled up just in time, missing the parked planes by just a couple feet. The pilots, still shaken from the near miss, saved hundreds of lives. After the incident, a full investigation was conducted. Now, there are new safety measures, but there are still concerns about whether the lessons learned are enough. Recent years have seen an alarming rise in such awful close calls. Qantas Flight 32, a scheduled flight from London to Sydney via Singapore, encountered a critical emergency on November 4, 2010. Just minutes after taking off from Singapore's Changi Airport, as an Airbus A380 was flying over the Riau Islands in Indonesia, it encountered a serious problem. One of its 4 engines underwent an uncontained failure. For the next 2 hours, the crew faced a tense and difficult situation as they tried to figure out how badly the plane was damaged. The accident happened at 10:01 a.m. Singapore time. When the engine went off, pieces of it flew into the wing, damaging important systems. The fuel system was hit, causing leaks and even starting a fire in one of the fuel tanks. It also took out one of the plane's hydraulic systems, which help control things like the flaps and landing gear. It disabled the anti-lock brakes, which are crucial for safe landings. 2 of the other engines started to lose power as well, and the flaps, which help control the plane's descent and speed, were damaged. Despite the harm to the aircraft, the crew realized it was still controllable. They decided to circle near Singapore for about 50 minutes while they carefully checked the condition of the aircraft. The first officer and the supervising captain then used a special landing calculator to see if they could land safely at Changi, even though the plane was 50 tons heavier than its maximum landing weight. At first, the system couldn't give them a landing distance, but after adjusting for the fact that the runway was dry, it showed they could land with only 328 feet of runway left to spare. At 11:45 a.m., the plane landed safely at Changi Airport, but because it was going about 40 miles per hour faster than usual, 4 of its tires blew out when it touched down. After landing, the crew ran into another problem. They couldn't shut off the number 1 engine. Emergency crews had to step in and put out the engine themselves. The crew had to decide whether to evacuate the plane right away because fuel was leaking near the overheated brakes, which could have caused a fire. Captain David Evans later explained that, despite the risk, it was actually safer to keep everyone on board until things settled down. The cabin crew stayed on high alert, ready to evacuate passengers immediately if the situation got worse. To make things even tougher, the plane was running on battery power, which meant they could only use one radio to communicate with emergency services. Luckily, the danger passed, and everyone was able to leave the plane calmly using a set of stairs. Everyone on board, 440 passengers and 29 crew members, got out safely. On the ground in Batam, some debris from the engine fell on a school, houses, and a car, but thankfully, everyone was okay there as well. Just a few missteps could have made that situation turn out very differently, but luckily the crew handled it like heroes. Investigators eventually found that the problem started because a small oil pipe in the engine had been poorly made, leading to the disaster. This was the first time an engine failure like this had happened on an A380. It was, and still is, the world's largest passenger plane at the time. As a result, Qantas and some other airlines temporarily grounded all of its A380 planes to ensure they were safe. Another similar incident happened with Northwest Airlines Flight 85 in 2002. The plane took off from Detroit Metropolitan Airport at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. There were 4 pilots on board. About 7 hours into the flight, flying at 35,000 feet, an unexpected issue struck. The plane veered sharply, banking to the left. The pilots initially thought an engine had failed. The senior captain quickly returned to the cockpit and took manual control. An emergency was declared, and they decided to divert the flight to Anchorage. It was hard to communicate, as they were in a zone with weak signals. Eventually, they connected with another Northwest Airlines flight nearby, which relayed their emergency call to Alaska. The situation was so unusual that none of the usual emergency procedures worked. The flight crew called Northwest Airlines headquarters in Minneapolis for help, but even they couldn't find a solution. Thankfully, the pilots worked together to control the plane. They managed to steer the plane using the ailerons, and by applying more power to one engine than the other. This tricky maneuver allowed them to land safely at Anchorage. After the incident, the NTSB and Boeing investigated once again. The NTSB investigator described it as a dramatic event that required careful examination. They found a crack in the power control module for the rudder, which had caused part of its metal housing to break. This break was unusual because it affected the module's outer casing, not just the inside parts. The NTSB concluded that the crack led to what's known as a rudder hardover, where the rudder is pushed to its maximum position and stays there, causing the sudden dangerous turn. All of these horrible situations show how fatigue, miscommunication, and outdated procedures can lead to disasters. But the sheer number of them in history, especially in U.S. airports, raises the question of whether enough lessons have truly been learned. The plane broke into 3 large pieces and crashed onto the hillside, scattering parts all over the snowy ground. The wings ripped off, and the main body of the aircraft split into 2 parts. Flames crackled from what was left of the airplane. 7 out of 9 crew members survived the crash. They were all part of the 1946 U.S. mission to map the Antarctic continent. There were 13 ships, 23 aircraft, and 4,700 people to do the job. They only had 2 months of summer down there before the weather got too bad. USS Pine Island took 3 seaplanes on their mission. One of the planes, called George 1, had a crew of 9 people. They went on their first 10-hour mission. Later, when it was time for the second flight, the weather got worse, with stormy seas and low visibility. But they decided to take the chance and fly anyway. It was supposed to be an epic adventure, and even the captain of Pine Island joined the expedition. The pilot, Ralph Frenchy LeBlanc, was very experienced and not worried about the weather. The plane was tied to some small boats, but the waves were so strong that the lines holding it were damaging the plane's metal body. Crew members had to attach 4 special rocket boosters, called jet-assisted takeoff bottles, to help the plane lift off. It managed to do so after a run of about 5 miles, but got straight into a blinding snowstorm. James Robbie Robbins was just 19 years old back then, but already had 1,500 hours of experience as a radar operator in that type of seaplane. He once successfully flew 9 hours through thick fog and clouds in Greenland, so he trusted his abilities. The radar showed a mountain range 20 miles ahead and icebergs spread out, and it was all correct. They had to stay low to take photos for mapping, and it was impossible in bad weather. So the pilot decided to turn the plane around to head back to the ship. Suddenly, the plane hit something. At the time, they didn't know what it was, but later they realized it was a snow-covered ridge that was hidden and couldn't be seen on radar. The loud bang shocked everyone on board. The pilot and co-pilot quickly pushed the plane's controls to try to lift it back into the sky. But just a few seconds later, the fuel tank in the front of the plane blew up. Collapsing with a ridge likely cracked one of the fuel tanks, so the gas started to leak. The fumes from the gas might have been set on fire by an electrical spark or the plane's hot engines. The blast was so strong that it broke the plane into 3 parts. The pilot was hurt and stuck upside down in the burning front part of the aircraft. Some of the other men were also badly injured. Some crawled out of the wreckage, and others had been thrown out into the snow during the crash. Most of them couldn't even remember the bang or the impact. The crew managed to pull the trapped pilot out of the wreckage and put him into a sleeping bag inside the back part of the plane. They also tried to help Frederick Williams, who was severely injured. They placed him on a piece of debris to keep him still and wrapped him in blankets to keep him warm. Unfortunately, even though they did their best to take care of them, Williams passed away a few hours later. Sadly, the navigator and the radio man didn't survive the crash either. 3 crew members had only one blanket, so they took turns staying in the middle where it was warmer. For the first 3 days, the weather was really bad. It snowed a lot, and the sky was super dark and cloudy. The crew started looking through the wreckage for anything useful. Near what used to be the back part of the plane, they found 3 big boxes of pemmican. It's a kind of emergency food that has everything you need to stay healthy, but it's not the most delicious food on Earth. Each box had about 100 paper cups filled with this special food. They also found better food in the flight rations. There were steaks, potatoes, canned veggies, bread, butter, salt, pepper, sugar, canned milk, a few cookies, and even 2 big cans of peanut butter. They had enough food to last for a while, and they figured the pemmican would help them get through the long, dark winter if necessary. All of the fresh food was hidden in the snow, where the kitchen used to be, so they had to dig it out. They got most of the sugar by licking it off the snow and separating it by taste. The crew also found a small 2-burner stove in the emergency supplies, but they didn't have any fuel. Luckily, the plane had some fuel left in the tanks, so they tapped one of the lines and had enough to last a long time. They kept the burners constantly on to melt snow to fill 2 or 3 water holders that held about 4 or 5 gallons each. It seemed like it took 15 or 20 pots of snow to fill just 1 cup of water. After 3 days, the weather got better, the sky was clear, and the sun was shining brightly. From where they were, they could see the ocean down the hill. While exploring the wreckage, they found more sleeping bags, a camera with film, and other supplies like a sled and a life raft made for 9 people. Days went by, and the sun never went down. Huge, hungry seagulls hanging out right next to the wreck were getting on everyone's nerves. To distract themselves a bit, the crew played an old Navy game called Salvo. It's like a battleships game for 2 players, where your task is to find and defeat all the ships of your rival. They also took some photos of everyone and the wreck from different angles with a Brownie box camera they had on the plane. The radar man painted big yellow letters on the airplane's wings with the names of the deceased crew members to make sure rescuers knew what had happened. On the 13th day, a rescue plane finally showed up. Everyone shouted, waved, and did everything to get the pilot's attention, but the plane didn't stop and kept flying. 2 hours later, it came back, and Robbins, in a hurry, threw fuel onto a pile of flammable stuff to set it on fire. The bang was so big, it burned his eyebrows, but it worked. The plane turned and flew toward them, wiggling its wings as a sign it saw them. The pilot dropped a note attached to a weight. It said, "If you can walk to the lake, make a circle. If not, form a straight line." The lake was 10 miles away, but they knew they had no choice but to get there, and so they made a circle, signaling that they were ready for rescue. Then they got to work. They stacked sleeping bags on a sled and placed their injured pilot on top. Robbins took a compass from the crashed plane and attached it to the sled's handlebars to help guide them. 3 men pulled the sled while another walked behind, making sure they stayed on track. The snow was so deep that they often sank up to their waists. The journey only got easier when they reached solid ground. So it took them 24 hours to walk the 10 miles to the shore. As they got close, a thick fog rolled in, so they couldn't see the rescue plane. But the pilots started the engines and the crew followed the sound. Soon, 2 rescuers arrived in a raft and helped them paddle out to the waiting plane. They climbed aboard and flew back to their ship, the Pine Island. All the survivors were taken to the USS Philippine Sea and later returned home. For 6 of the 9 men who crashed on Thurston Island, life continued.
Have you ever watched an action-packed Hollywood film where an airplane gets a hole in its side and everyone starts freaking out? Stuff starts flying all over the place and people are barely staying in their seats. Well, in real life, a small hole in the plane's body isn't going to cause that much drama. However, I have an incredible story to tell you about a pilot who actually managed to land a plane with half of its roof missing. Can you believe it? Make sure your seatbelt is fastened because this one is going to be a wild ride. On April 28, 1988, a Boeing 737 owned by Aloha Airlines took off from Hilo International Airport en route to Honolulu. Before this flight, the plane had already flown 3 short trips from Honolulu to Hilo, Maui, and Kauai. Everything was chill that day, and the weather was nice and calm. It looked like smooth sailing all the way. The captain of the flight was Robert Schornsteimer, and the co-pilot was Madeline Tompkins, both experienced pilots with thousands of flight hours in the Boeing 737. Bright and early that morning, before taking off from Honolulu, Madeline did the regular pre-flight inspection and said that everything was good to go. At 11 a.m., they took off from Honolulu and went to Maui, then Hilo. When they got to Hilo, they didn't leave the cockpit or check the plane from the outside. It wasn't a requirement, so why bother? At 1:25 p.m., the plane took off for the final leg of the round trip, with 95 people on board. 89 passengers, 2 pilots, 3 flight attendants, and an FAA traffic controller who sat in the observer seat in the cockpit. The plane had taken off like normal and reached its cruising altitude of 24,000 feet without any hiccups. But then, 26 miles from Kahului, things went totally haywire. The pilots heard a loud whooshing sound, followed by a crack, and then a rush of wind that was so loud it was deafening. Turns out, a small section of the roof on the left side had come loose, causing the plane to decompress explosively. And to make matters even worse, the decompression caused a chain reaction that led to a huge chunk of the plane's roof ripping off completely. That missing part was a massive 18.5 feet long and was part of the skin that covered the plane from the cockpit all the way back to the forewing area. The pilots didn't have a clue what was going on when the disaster struck. The first officer, who was the one in charge of the plane at that time, suddenly felt her head snap back, and then she saw a bunch of gray insulation and debris flying around the cockpit like it was a tornado. Meanwhile, the captain took a look around and was shocked to see that the cockpit door was nowhere to be seen, and instead of the first-class ceiling, he was staring straight up at the sky. The plane started to tilt from side to side, making it challenging to keep it under control. The crew in the cockpit quickly put on their oxygen masks, and the captain took over control of the plane. He then initiated an emergency descent towards the nearest airport on Maui Island. Luckily, all the passengers were seated, and most of them had their seatbelts fastened since the seatbelt sign was still on. Unfortunately, the 3 flight attendants were caught off guard. One of them was near the hole and was pulled out of the plane. The other 2 were thrown to the floor, with one of them hitting her head hard and losing consciousness. The third attendant tried to help the passengers and keep them calm. At the same time, the pilots were desperately trying to let air traffic control know that they were in trouble. But there were communication problems even between themselves due to the loud noise and the fact that they were wearing oxygen masks. They had to resort to hand signals to understand each other. Moreover, they were unsure whether their messages were being heard by ATC. The plane's controls were not responding properly, which made the captain's job of flying the plane even harder. The first officer was doing her best to assist the captain and communicate with the tower. It was only after the plane descended to an altitude of 14,000 feet that the controller finally received their distress call and immediately started making arrangements for an emergency landing. The control tower wasn't prepared for a situation like this, though. In fact, the tower had to call 911, just like any other regular person would do in case of an emergency. The problem was that the controller didn't understand the severity of the situation, and they didn't realize that the passengers and crew members would need medical help. This was because the crew had only reported a rapid decompression and hadn't explained the entire situation in detail. The plane was in a very bad mess, but the captain was doing everything he could to safely land the plane. As they descended towards the airport, the captain commanded the first officer to lower the landing gear, but the indicator light didn't turn on. The plane also had an issue with the left engine, which failed as they approached the runway. Despite these problems, the captain used the reverse thrust of the working engine to try and land the plane. It was a difficult and dangerous task, but they managed to land the plane safely on the runway. The passengers and crew members were then evacuated from the plane. It was a miracle that everyone survived. However, 65 people were injured. They had been hit by debris and pieces of the plane's body that were flying around. Unfortunately, the ground staff wasn't aware of the severity of the situation and didn't have enough resources to provide immediate medical assistance to the injured passengers. The first ambulance arrived 7 minutes after the plane landed, which wasn't an ideal scenario. Furthermore, there were only 2 ambulances on the entire island, which couldn't accommodate all the injured people. As a result, tour vans were used to transport the passengers to the hospital. Fortunately, 2 drivers who were former paramedics provided immediate first aid to the injured right on the runway. Meanwhile, the airport mechanics and office staff took the vans to the hospital, which was located 3 miles away. Despite the chaotic and stressful circumstances, only 8 people suffered severe injuries, but they all later made a full recovery. The plane was in really bad shape though, and it was no wonder it couldn't handle the stress of the decompression incident. Despite its age not being a problem, it had experienced a whole lot of takeoffs and landings, which took a toll on its integrity. The salty and humid environment it operated in only added to the damage. You see, planes are designed to withstand a certain number of flight cycles, and this plane had exceeded that number by a long shot. The majority of its flights were short domestic ones, which meant it had to take off and land way more times than it was designed for. This is what ultimately led to the roof coming off during the flight. The poor condition of the plane meant that it was beyond repair and had to be dismantled right there at the airport. What's interesting is that in an interview after the accident, one passenger recalled that she had noticed a crack in the plane's fuselage while she was boarding. She didn't tell the flight crew about it because she didn't think it was worth it, so they didn't know to check it. It's important to remember that these types of accidents are very rare nowadays. Major airlines and airports take numerous steps to ensure safety, and according to Harvard University, the chances of being in an airplane accident are about 1 in 1.2 million. That's a tiny percentage, and I don't know about you, but I find that very comforting. And even if something did happen, such as the roof of the plane coming off, it's reassuring to know that the pilots are trained to handle emergencies and can still land the plane safely.
That's it for today. So hey, if you pacified your curiosity, then give the video a like and share it with your friends. Or if you want more, just click on these videos and stay on the bright side.